I wanted a husband. Lila Chen's voice cracked like a whip across the empty platform. Not a gunman who smells like gunpowder and bad news. The stranger didn't flinch, didn't apologize, just stood there with that letter in his hand. Thomas Garrett's last words sealed and delivered by a man who looked like he'd buried 100 of them. "Thomas is dead," he said. Flat, final. Like it cost him nothing, but it cost Lila everything. She'd staked her land, her name, her last hope on a man who would never arrive. And now this one had. If this story already has you gripping your seat, subscribe to our channel and follow every twist to the very end. Drop a comment right now telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning Lila Chen walked to Dust Ridge Station, she wore the only dress she hadn't sold. It was her mother's dress, faded blue cotton, with small white flowers along the collar. The kind of dress a woman wore when she was trying to believe something good was finally coming. Lila had pressed it the night before with a flat iron heated twice on the stove, and she'd stood in front of the cracked mirror above the wash basin and told herself this was the beginning of something different. She was wrong. But she didn't know that yet. She carried no bouquet. She hadn't been able to afford flowers. What she carried instead was a folded letter from Thomas Garrett, the fourth letter he'd sent her, the one where he described himself as a man of modest means and honest habits, where he wrote that he looked forward to learning who she was, and where he signed his name with careful, deliberate strokes, like a man who understood the weight of a promise. She had read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft along the folds. The platform was half empty. A freight agent dozed against a barrel. Two women from the mercantile stood near the far end, talking in low voices, cutting their eyes toward Lila, with the particular cruelty of women who already knew something you didn't. Lila ignored them. She'd been ignoring them her whole life. The train was 12 minutes late. She counted every one of those minutes, standing straight-backed at the edge of the platform, watching the horizon where the rail line bent out of sight behind a ridge of dry bluffs. Dust Ridge had earned its name honestly. Everything here was dust, the roads, the rooftops, the future. You either made something out of what little the land offered, or you left. Lila's father had spent 30 years making something out of it. The bank was in the process of making sure none of that counted anymore. She heard the train before she saw it. The low iron rumble came up through the boards beneath her feet, then the smoke, then the shape of it rolling out from behind the bluffs like a decision that couldn't be taken back. She straightened the collar of her mother's dress. The train slowed. The brakes screamed against the rails. Steam rolled across the platform in thick white curtains, and Lila stood in it with her hands clasped in front of her, watching the passenger car door for a man she had never met, but had chosen to trust with everything she had left. The door opened. People stepped down. A family with 3 children, luggage roped together with twine. An older man in a minister's collar. A woman in traveling clothes who moved like she had somewhere important to be. A boy carrying a wooden crate with holes punched in the top, something alive moving inside. Lila watched each one, cataloged each one. Thomas Garrett was 31 years old, 5 feet 10 inches brown hair, with a scar on his left hand from a fence wire accident he'd described in his second letter with the kind of rueful humor that had made her trust him. No one matched. The platform thinned. The freight agent woke up and began moving crates. The 2 women from the mercantile were already gone, and somehow that felt like confirmation of something. The passenger car door opened one more time. A man stepped down. He was not Thomas Garrett. Lila knew it before she had a single rational reason to know it. She knew it the way you know when weather is changing. Something in the air shifted. Something pulled tight in her chest. He was tall. Not broad, the way laboring men were broad, but dense like everything extra had been stripped off him by years of doing things that couldn't be undone. He wore a dark coat that had seen hard use. A hat pulled low. 2 days of dust on his boots that looked like it might be permanent. And at his hip, holstered with the casual familiarity of a man who had never once in his life forgotten. It was there, a revolver. He stepped onto the platform and stopped. He looked at Lila the way men looked at a problem they'd been sent to solve and weren't particularly happy about. Then he reached inside his coat, drew out an envelope, and held it out to her. "You, Lila Chen." His voice was low and even. Not unkind exactly, but not warm. The voice of a man who had learned to say difficult things without decoration. She didn't take the envelope. "Where is Thomas Garrett?" Something crossed his face. Not guilt. Not quite. More like a man steadying himself for a task he'd agreed to carry out because someone once asked him to, and honor didn't give him the option of refusal. "Thomas Garrett is dead," he said. The platform seemed to tilt. Lila heard the words. She understood each one individually. She simply could not make them mean what they meant. Her eyes dropped to the envelope in his hand, cream-colored her name written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize Thomas's name in the upper corner. "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "When, 4 months ago, disease. He was working a freight contract in the mountain camps. It moved fast." He paused. "He asked me to come in his place, to make sure you were—" "Who are you?" "Cade Voss." The name meant nothing to her. It should have, as she would later understand. But standing on that platform, in her mother's dress, with Thomas Garrett's last letter folded in her hand, and this stranger's voice still hanging in the air between them, it was just 2 syllables, attached to nothing. "Why would he send you?" she said. "He didn't know you. He couldn't have—" "He knew me well enough." Something behind his eyes went quiet the way a fire goes quiet when it's burning its hottest. "We worked the same freight route, shared a camp for 6 weeks. A man talks when he knows he's running out of time." He extended the envelope again. "He wrote this for you, in case he didn't make it." Lila took it. She stared at her own name in Thomas's deliberate handwriting. She had the absurd particular grief of recognizing the hand of someone you never met. Someone who had only ever existed to you as ink on paper and now would only ever exist that way. She looked up at Cade Voss. "He's really gone." "Yes." "And you came anyway." "I made a promise." The simple brutality of that answer, no apology in it, no performance of sympathy, just the plain fact of an obligation honored, cracked something open in Lila that she hadn't expected. She had been bracing for devastation all morning without knowing it. She had felt it in the weight of the dress, in the careful ironing in the 12 minutes she'd counted on the platform. Some part of her had known. And now this stranger was standing in front of her, with Thomas Garrett's last words and a gun on his hip, and the absolute nerve to look like this was a reasonable situation. "I wanted a husband," Lila said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. "Not a gunman who smells like gunpowder and bad news." Cade Voss looked at her for a long moment. He didn't look offended. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been told worse things by better people and had survived all of them. "Then you're out of luck," he said, "because I'm what's left." She didn't open Thomas's letter until she was home. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands, the envelope on the wood in front of her, the afternoon light coming through the single west-facing window at an angle that made everything look like the end of something. Which it was. She opened it. Thomas Garrett wrote in the same careful hand she recognized from 4 months of correspondence, but this letter was different. The sentences were shorter, the handwriting less deliberate, the pen pressed harder in places, lighter in others, the uneven rhythm of a man writing against time and failing strength. "Miss Chen, if Cade is giving you this, then I didn't make it. I'm sorry. I meant to. I want you to know that I meant every word I wrote you, and that I thought the future we talked about was worth building. Cade Voss is the most stubborn and most honorable man I've ever met, and I say that knowing those 2 things aren't usually found together. He saved my life twice before I got sick, and he sat with me when I couldn't get up anymore. He doesn't show much. Don't let that fool you. I asked him to go to you. He didn't want to. I told him the only way I'd die in peace was if he promised, so he promised. That's the only thing in the world that will make Cade Voss do something he doesn't want to do, a deathbed promise from someone he considers his responsibility." I don't know what that means for you. I know you needed a husband to hold your land. I know the situation was desperate when you wrote me, and I don't think 4 months has made it better. Tell Cade the full truth of it. He'll figure something out. He always does. I'm sorry I couldn't come myself. Thomas Garrett. Lila set the letter down. She sat with it for a long time. Then she picked up the bank notice that had been sitting beneath Thomas's envelope. She'd found it in the door when she came home, tucked into the frame like a knife, and she read it again, even though she already knew every word. 14 days. That was what the bank had given her. 14 days to produce the payment on her father's debt, a debt that had been restructured twice already, a debt that Harlan Dowd at the Dust Ridge Territorial Bank had been patient about for exactly as long as patience served his interests. The note had changed hands 3 months ago. The new holder, whoever they were, had given her 2 weeks. Lila's father had built the Rafter C from nothing. He'd broken the ground himself, run fence line, himself lost fingers to machinery, and years to drought, and still held on. He'd died of a heart attack at his kitchen table 2 winters ago, and left her the deed and the debt in equal measure. She'd sold the cattle down to a working herd, sold. The second horse sold her mother's jewelry piece by piece, and it had bought her time, but not salvation. Thomas Garrett had been salvation, or the idea of him had been. Now there was a stranger named Cade Voss sitting in her barn. She'd told him there was a cot there, which there was because she wasn't inviting a man she didn't know into her house, regardless of what letters said about his character, and a bank notice with 14 days left on it and nothing else. She went to the barn at dusk. Cade Voss was sitting on an overturned bucket cleaning his revolver, with the focused attention of a man who treated maintenance as meditation. He didn't look up when she came in. "I read Thomas's letter," she said. "I figured you would. He said to tell you the full truth of it. He mentioned you had land trouble. More than trouble." She leaned against the stall door and crossed her arms. "The bank is calling in my father's debt. 14 days. I don't have the money, and I don't have a way to get it." Cade set the revolver down across his knee and looked at her for the first time since she'd walked in. His eyes were a kind of gray that changed depending on the light, darker now in the low lantern glow, steady and assessing. "How much? More than you have. More than I'll have in 14 days. How much?" She told him. He didn't react, which was somehow both better and worse than if he had. He just picked up the revolver again and went back to the cylinder, running the cloth through with the same careful focus. "There's a way," he said. "You're not going to like it." "I already don't like anything about today. Say it anyway." He looked up again. Something in his expression had shifted, not softer exactly, but more careful. Like a man choosing his words with full awareness of their weight. "You needed a husband to hold the land," he said. "That's still true. The debt is against your name and your father's estate. If you marry the property and debt consolidate under both names, and some territorial courts will allow a restructuring petition from a married couple that they won't grant to a single woman. Especially if the husband has a stake in working the land." Lila stared at him. "You're not suggesting—" "Thomas asked me to protect you and your land," Cade said. "I promised him I would. I'm telling you the legal reality of your situation. What you do with it is your choice. You're a stranger. Yes. You carry a gun for a living. I did, past tense. What do you do now?" A pause, long enough to mean something. "Whatever I promised to do." Lila pushed off the stall door and walked the length of the barn and back because she needed to move, because the walls were too close and the proposition was too large, and the absolute rational clarity of it was making her angrier than she knew what to do with. "This is insane," she said. "Yes, you know it's insane. I know it's the option you have. I could go to the bank. I could ask for more time. You've already done that twice." She stopped walking. "How do you know that?" "Thomas read me your letters, all of them." At her sharp look, he said, "He wanted me to understand the situation before I got here. He wasn't careless with your business, Miss Chen. He was dying, and he was trying to make sure someone understood what you needed." The anger went somewhere complicated. It didn't leave, it just changed shape, became something with more grief in it and less fire. "He knew you," she said. "Well enough to ask this of you." "He thought he did." "And did he?" Cade Voss looked at her steadily. "He was close enough." She didn't sleep. She lay in her father's bed. She'd never moved to the larger room, had slept in the small room off the kitchen her whole life, and she stared at the ceiling and did the arithmetic she'd been doing for 2 years, the same arithmetic that always came out wrong. The debt was real. The 14 days were real. The territorial law Cade had described, she didn't know enough to dispute it, and something in his flat recitation of it had the ring of a man who had spent time around courts and law, whether he'd wanted to or not. Thomas had trusted him. That was the only solid piece she had. Thomas Garrett had shared a camp with this man for 6 weeks, had trusted him enough to sit with him while he was dying, had spent enough of his last breath on Cade Voss to extract a promise and write a letter recommending him to the woman he'd never met and now would never meet. Thomas had been a careful man. His letters showed that. A man who chose his words and meant them. She read Thomas's letter 2 more times before dawn. "The most stubborn and most honorable man I've ever met." At first light, she made coffee and went to the barn. Cade was already awake. He'd folded the blanket she'd left him with the corners squared, and he was standing at the barn door, looking out at her land with the particular stillness of a man who had learned to read landscapes the way other men read text. She handed him a cup. He took it without comment. "If we did this," she said, "it would be a legal arrangement, a practical one, nothing more." "Understood. You'd work the ranch in exchange for room and board and a stake in the land. If the ranch recovers, you get a fair share. If it doesn't—" She stopped. "If it doesn't, we're both out the same door," he said. "I want it in writing, whatever we agree to." "Good idea. I'm not—" She stopped again, tried to find words for something that felt like it needed them. "I'm not doing this because I want a husband. I'm doing it because I have no other choice that isn't watching my father's 30 years disappear into a bank's ledger." Cade Voss turned from the door and looked at her. In the early morning light, his face was easier to read, which wasn't saying much, but she could see that he was listening. Really listening the way people did when they were tracking what was said between the words. "I know," he said. "You're doing this because of a promise." "Yes. And when the promise is fulfilled, when the land is safe and the debt is settled." He considered that with a patience she hadn't expected. Like the question deserved an honest answer, and he wasn't in the habit of offering anything else. "I don't know yet," he said. "But that's honest, and I'd rather give you honest than comfortable." Lila looked at him. For the first time since the train platform, she saw past the gun and the dust and the 2 syllables of his name, and she saw the shape of the thing Thomas had tried to tell her. Not a good man, maybe, but a real one. "We do this at the courthouse," she said. "Today, before I change my mind." "All right. And Cade," she held his gaze, "if you break a promise to me the way the bank broke their patience with my father, if you take my trust and make something ugly out of it, I will make the rest of your life very difficult." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more significant than that. "Thomas said the same thing," he said. "About you." Judge Harlan Pruitt had been performing courthouse marriages in Dust Ridge for 22 years. He had married people in love, people in trouble, people who were barely speaking, and people who had been brought in by their families under a kind of genteel compulsion that everyone pretended wasn't compulsion. He had never in 22 years performed a marriage quite like this one. Lila Chen stood on one side of his desk in her mother's dress, still the only one she had, with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin level, the expression of a woman who had made her decision and was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her waver. Cade Voss stood on the other side with his hat in his hands and the revolver conspicuously present at his hip, and an expression that Judge Pruitt could only describe as scrupulously neutral, neither reluctant nor eager, simply present in the manner of a man performing a duty he'd accepted. There were no witnesses, other than the judge's clerk, who was 17 years old and watched the whole proceeding with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Do you, Lila Chen, take this man?" the judge began. "I do," Lila said. "Not fast exactly, but with finality, the way you shut a door on weather." The judge turned to Cade. "Do you, Cade Voss, take this woman?" "I do." 2 words, same weight, same finality. Judge Pruitt looked at them both over his reading spectacles. "You may," he started, and Lila said, "Thank you, Judge," and turned and walked toward the door, which was in 22 years the first time a bride had beaten him to his own closing. Cade followed her out. On the courthouse steps in the full midday sun, with dust ridge going about its business around them, Lila Chen stood and let out a long, slow breath that she had been holding, it felt like, since the train platform. "Done," she said. "Done." Cade agreed. "Now we go back to the ranch and figure out how to save it." She walked down the steps. He fell in beside her, not close, not distant, the precise measured distance of a man who understood that proximity had to be earned. At the edge of the courthouse square, a man leaning against a post watched them pass. Lila didn't notice him. Cade did. He marked the man's face, the angle of his hat, the way his right hand rested near his belt, with the particular patience of someone who had been told to watch and wait. Cade said nothing, but his hand moved almost imperceptibly to his side. Whatever promise he'd come here to keep it was going to cost more than he'd told her. He'd known that before he stepped off the train. He just hadn't decided yet whether to tell her how much. The bank notice had said 14 days. On the evening of their first day as husband and wife, a phrase that sat in Lila's mind, with the same wrongness as a piece of furniture moved to the wrong room, she brought out her father's ledgers and spread them across the kitchen table. Cade sat across from her. She'd made a simple meal, salt pork biscuits, black coffee, and he'd eaten without complaint and without effusion, which she found she preferred to either excessive gratitude or thinly veiled criticism. He ate the way he did everything else, with attention and without waste. "Tell me about the debt," he said. "All of it, not just the number." So she did. So she told him about her father's expansion 10 years ago. The second pasture, the new barn, the breeding stock that was supposed to multiply the herd and pay the loan in 5 years. She told him about the drought that came in year 3 and took the calves. She told him about the restructuring, and then the second restructuring, and the way Harlan Dowd at the bank had always been almost kind about it. Patient in a manner that she now understood had nothing to do with patience and everything to do with waiting for a better opportunity. "The debt changed hands 3 months ago," she said. "Someone bought it. I don't know who, Dowd wouldn't say. The notice came from a holding company. Territorial Resources Consolidated." Cade went still. Not visibly. Not in any way she could have pointed to and described. But something shifted behind his eyes, a recognition quick and dark that he swallowed before it reached his face. "You know that name," Lila said. He looked at her. "Say it," she said. "It's a holding company," he said carefully. "Used to acquire land and assets in the territory. Usually works at the edges of things, buys distressed debt foreclosures, disputed titles." "Whose holding company?" A pause. "I need to look into it before I say a name." "Cade." "Lila." His voice was quiet but absolute. "I need to be sure before I tell you something that could change everything. Give me until morning." She held his gaze for a long moment. She was trying to read him the way she'd read the land her whole life. The small signs that told you what was coming before it arrived. He wasn't lying. She was nearly certain of that. But he was withholding, and she didn't yet know the difference with him between withholding that protected and withholding that harmed. "Morning," she said. "And then you tell me everything." "Everything I know," he said. "That's what I can promise." She accepted it, for now. She folded the ledger closed and stood and took the plates to the basin. Outside, the night had gone fully dark, the kind of dark the Colorado Territory did, with absolute commitment. No halfway measures, no city glow on the horizon, just the full weight of the sky pressing down. She heard Cade push back his chair. "I'll take watch," he said. "First few hours." She turned. "Watch for what?" He was already moving toward the door. "Sleep, Lila. You look like you haven't in 3 days." She wanted to argue. She also hadn't slept in 3 days. "Wake me at 2, she said. "All right." He went out. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the dark for a long moment. The shapes of the outbuildings, the fence line, the flat dark horizon, and she thought about Thomas Garrett dying in a mountain camp, with this man sitting beside him. And she thought about promises made to the dying. And she thought about the way Cade Voss had gone still when she said the name of the holding company that owned her debt. "I need to be sure before I tell you something that could change everything." She was already sure it was bad. The only question was how bad. She went to bed. In the kitchen, through the window, the figure of Cade Voss moved slowly along the perimeter of the yard. Hat low hand, near his side, watching the dark with the practiced patience of a man who had learned that danger always came from the direction you stopped watching. On the road half a mile south, a lantern moved between trees, then went dark, and Dust Ridge slept on, not knowing that a marriage made of necessity had just caught the attention of the most dangerous man in the Colorado Territory. She found him at the kitchen table before dawn. He'd made coffee. She didn't know how he'd found everything without waking her, but he had, and he was sitting with a piece of paper in front of him, writing. He stopped when she came in, folded the paper. "I said morning," she reminded him. "It's morning." She poured coffee and sat across from him. Outside, the gray pre-dawn light was making shapes of things. "Tell me," she said. Cade unfolded the paper. It had a name written on it, and below the name, several lines in a compressed, precise hand. He slid it across the table. She read it. "Dalton Cray," she said. "He controls most of the freight and outlaw networks in this part of the territory." Territorial Resources Consolidated is one of 6 holding companies that front his legitimate business interests. He uses them to acquire land along the freight routes, land that has water or great access for roads or strategic position. My land, your father's land, sits on the only reliable water source for 12 miles in either direction. Any operation moving freight through this part of the territory needs it. Lila set down her coffee. She looked at the name, Dalton Cray. She'd heard it. Everyone in Dust Ridge had heard it in the abstract way you heard about weather systems or wars in distant territories. A name attached to trouble that always seemed to happen somewhere else to someone else. Until it didn't. "How do you know this much about him?" she asked. Cade looked at her across the table. He didn't answer right away. He picked up his coffee and held it, and looked at her with that careful, measuring steadiness that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, it was precision. He was a man who chose when to speak with the same deliberation he gave to everything else. "Because," he said finally, "I used to work for him." The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, a bird started somewhere in the fence line. The pre-dawn gray was shifting toward pale gold at the edges. Lila Chen looked at the man she had married 14 hours ago. "Tell me," she said. "All of it." And he did. He told her the way men tell things they've been carrying too long. Not all at once, not with any particular relief, but piece by piece, like setting down weight he'd gotten used to, and had almost forgotten wasn't his to keep. He'd been 24 when he first went to work for Dalton Cray. Not as muscle, he wanted her to understand that though he said it without asking for her understanding. He'd been a lawman, first a deputy in a small county 2 territories east, and he'd been good at it. Good enough that Cray had noticed him and made an offer that was framed as a private security contract, but was in practice something closer to enforcement. "I told myself the difference mattered," Cade said. "For about a year I believed it." He collected debts. He delivered messages that were really warnings. He stood in doorways while other men had conversations they didn't want interrupted. He was the presence in the room that made people cooperative, and he was very good at it because he never had to do more than be present. His reputation preceded him faster than his name did. "And then," Lila said, And then a man named Eli Holt didn't pay what Cray said he owed. I was sent to persuade him." He paused. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't notice or didn't care. Holt had a wife, 2 kids. The farm was already gone, Bank had it. He had nothing left that Cray could actually take. Cray knew that. The point wasn't the debt anymore. The point was the message. "What did you do?" "I walked away." He said it flatly without drama. Rode back to Cray's camp and told him Holt had nothing, and I wasn't going to put hands on a man with nothing in front of his children. Cray didn't like that. "He let you walk." "No." A pause. "He tried to make an example of me instead. It didn't go the way he planned." His jaw set briefly. "After that, I was done in that county. Done in most of the territory. A man leaves Cray's operation without permission. He doesn't find welcome anywhere Cray has reach. Which is most places. Most places worth mentioning, yes." Lila turned her coffee cup in her hands, studying the grain of the table, rather than his face, because she found she could think more clearly when she wasn't trying to read him at the same time she was listening to him. "So Thomas found you when you were running," she said. "Thomas found me when I was working legitimate freight and trying to keep my head down." Something that wasn't quite humor moved briefly across his face. He was constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, wanted to know everybody's story, wanted to understand everybody's situation. He stopped. He was a good man, better than most. "I know," she said quietly. "I only knew him through letters, but I know." They sat with that for a moment. Then Lila put both hands flat on the table. "So Cray owns my debt, which means Cray wants my land. And you, the man I married yesterday, are a man Cray considers a deserter." "That's accurate." "So by marrying you, I've attached myself to your history with him." "It's possible he doesn't know yet." "It's possible," she repeated. "Not certain." "Not certain," he agreed. She stood up and went to the window. The sun was fully up now, the ranch coming into the kind of sharp morning light that made everything look either very real or very fragile, and right now it looked like both. The fence line her father had set with his own hands. The barn he'd built the summer she was 8. The second pasture where the grass was still good, still worth something to someone who knew land. "He'll come for the ranch regardless," she said. "With or without you in the picture. The debt is real and the deadline is real, and Cray has been patient about it because he expects it to fall into his hands like fruit off a tree." "Yes. So you being here doesn't make my situation worse. It just makes his easier to understand." "That's one way to see it." She turned from the window. "What's the other way?" Cade looked at her steadily. "The other way is that a man like Cray doesn't let loose ends walk around getting married in courthouse ceremonies in towns where he has eyes. And that man I saw watching us yesterday on the courthouse steps." Lila went still. "What man?" "Leaning on the post near the assay office. Dark hat. Watching us leave." "You didn't say anything." "I wasn't certain what he was. I'm more certain now." The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the morning light less generous. "You think Cray already knows you're here," she said. "I think it's not a coincidence that your debt changed hands 3 months after Thomas wrote you about me." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that rearranges things. Lila sat back down. Not because her legs gave out, she wasn't the kind of woman whose legs gave out, but because she needed to be level and still, and think clearly, and she'd learned from her father that you thought better sitting down when the world was trying to knock you over. "Thomas wrote about you to me," she said slowly. "In his letters. I have them all. He mentioned you by name in the 3rd letter, said he'd met a man on the freight route who was worth knowing. Cray would have had eyes on Thomas, on the freight camps. He had eyes everywhere along those routes. So someone read Thomas's letters, or had them read, or knew enough to piece it together." Cade's voice was careful and precise. "Cray is not a stupid man. If he knew Thomas was corresponding with a woman in Dust Ridge, a woman with land on water access he would have had the situation looked at. And then Thomas died. And then Thomas died. And I came here instead." He paused. I didn't think it through far enough before I got on the train. I thought I was honoring a promise. I didn't stop to consider that the promise itself might have already been noticed. Lila looked at him. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not guilt exactly, but accountability. The expression of a man who was not making excuses for a miscalculation, but was also not pretending it hadn't happened. It was, she thought, a more honest response than most men would have managed. "What do we do?" she said. "We have 11 days before the bank deadline. We use them." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and for the first time she saw him shift from the contained stillness of a man on watch to something more focused, more forward-leaning, more alive. The debt is real, but the terms of foreclosure may not be airtight. Territorial law on distressed debt purchased by a holding company has provisions. There are filing requirements, notification periods that have to be documented. If any of those were skipped, the foreclosure clock resets. How do you know territorial law? I spent 3 years working around it. You learn the edges. Can we find out if they cut corners? I can find out. I need access to the county recorder's office and the territorial land office in Denver. The filing records are public. Lila straightened. Something ignited behind her eyes, not hope exactly, but the precursor to it. The recognition of a problem that might have a solution if you were willing to work hard enough and fast enough and smart enough to find it. She'd lived her whole life on the edge of problems like this. She knew what that feeling was worth. "I can ride to Denver," she said. No. Firm and immediate. "Cade, you leave this ranch and there's no one here to hold it. Crazed people see you gone, they'll move faster. The land needs someone standing on it." He held her gaze. "I'll go to the county recorder's office today. Denver can be done by telegram if we know what to ask for." "I know what to ask for," she said. "I've been in that recorder's office a dozen times since the debt restructured. I know which files and which filing dates matter." Something shifted in the way he was looking at her. A small recalibration. She'd seen it before in men who came in expecting to find one thing and found something different, not always welcome but honest. "Tell me," he said. So she did. She told him about the territorial statutes she'd read in the law books she'd borrowed from Judge Pruitt's office, about the notification requirements she'd memorized, about the specific dates the holding company would have needed to file if they wanted a clean foreclosure. She was not a lawyer, she said that plainly. But she was her father's daughter, and her father had always said that the only way to keep what was yours was to know more about it than the people trying to take it. By the time she finished, Cade Voss was looking at her with an expression she would come to recognize over time, but hadn't yet cataloged the look of a man genuinely surprised in a way he wasn't embarrassed to show. "Thomas didn't tell me that part," he said. "Thomas knew I was in trouble," she said. "He didn't know I'd been doing my own research." "Why didn't you use it?" "Because knowing the law and having money to hire someone to argue it in court are two different things." She held his gaze. "I know the problem. I needed the resources. That was what a husband was supposed to provide." He nodded slowly, not condescendingly, like a man revising a map. "All right," he said. "Then we work with what we both know. You tell me exactly which dates and filings to look for. I go to the recorder this morning. We find out what we have." It was the most straightforward conversation she'd had in 2 years, and she almost didn't know what to do with that. "There's one more thing," she said. He waited. "Sheriff Bowman. He needs to know there's a man on this ranch now. He's not reliable, he's old, and he picks his battles carefully, but he's not Cray's man as far as I know. If things get difficult, I'd rather he know I'm not alone." "Bowman knows me," Cade said. She hadn't expected that. From before. He didn't elaborate, but his jaw set slightly the way it did when something cost him something. "Is that going to be a problem?" "I don't know yet." He pushed back from the table and stood reaching for his hat. "But I'd rather find out now than when we need him and it's too late to know." He went out. Lila sat at the kitchen table with the 2 coffee cups and her father's ledgers, and the name Dalton Cray written on a piece of paper in Cade Voss's precise, compressed handwriting. And she thought about the particular arithmetic of desperation, how it had brought Thomas Garrett into her life through letters, and how it had brought Cade Voss to her door in Thomas's place, and how the same man who wanted her land had, without knowing it, sent her the one person in the territory who understood exactly how he operated. She didn't know if that was luck. She wasn't sure luck was a thing she believed in anymore. But it was something. She pulled the ledgers toward her and went back to work. The county recorder's office was a single room in the back of a building that also housed the land survey office and, on alternating Tuesdays, a circuit notary. Cade had been in rooms like it before, the particular combination of dust and document that said public record. The kind of place where every important thing that happened to land and money and names got written down and then promptly ignored until someone needed it to be forgotten. The clerk was a man named Aldous Fitch, 50-ish, with the resigned and careful manner of someone who had spent decades in proximity to other people's legal troubles without being able to do anything about any of them. He recognized Cade. Not from Dust Ridge, Cade had never been here before. He recognized the type, the way Cade moved through the office, direct and purposeful, the way his eyes went to the filing cabinets immediately, the way he asked for the Rafter C deed transfer records without any of the social preamble that civilians used. "You're a lawman," Fitch said. "Not quite a question." "Former," Cade said. "I'm the husband of the current deed holder. I want to see the full transfer history on the Rafter C debt, specifically everything involving Territorial Resources Consolidated." Fitch looked at him for a moment, then pulled 3 folders from a cabinet. Cade stood at the counter and read. He was not a fast reader, in the way people meant when they said fast. He didn't skim, didn't skip. He read the way he did everything, with full attention and without waste. Every filing date, every notary seal, every certificate of proper notification. He found what he was looking for on the 4th page of the 2nd folder. The notification to Lila Chen of the debt transfer from the original bank to Territorial Resources Consolidated was dated 93 days ago. Under territorial statute, the holder of record had to file notice of transfer with the county recorder within 30 days of acquisition and simultaneously provide written notice to the debt holder. The county recorder's copy was filed 93 days ago. Lila's copy, the notice she would have received, bore a postmark of 78 days ago. Lila had told him she'd received the initial transfer notice 2.5 months ago. He'd had her write down the exact date that morning. She was precise about dates. She had the original envelope postmarked filed in her father's desk, 69 days ago. Not 78, 69. 9 days later than the copy in this office claimed. Someone had backdated the delivery notice. Cade looked up at Aldous Fitch, who had been watching him with the expression of a man who had seen people find things in those folders before and knew that what came after was never simple. "I need a certified copy of everything in these 3 folders," Cade said. "Every page, notarized today." Fitch didn't move immediately. "That's a lot of copies." "Yes." Cade held the man's gaze. "The date on the delivery notice for the Rafter C debt holder doesn't match the postmark on the original envelope she still has. Someone filed a false document in your office, Mr. Fitch, which makes you either a victim of fraud or a participant in it. I'd rather find out which one now before this goes to a territorial judge." Fitch's face went through several expressions rapidly. He landed on something between indignation and genuine alarm, which told Cade what he needed to know. The man hadn't known. "I'll get the copy paper," Fitch said. Cade had the certified copies inside an hour. He walked out of the county recorder's office and into the full midday sun, and he stood for a moment on the wooden walkway and looked at what he was holding. It wasn't salvation. Not yet. A discrepancy in a filing date was grounds for a challenge. It could reset the foreclosure clock, potentially invalidate the current action entirely, depending on how a judge read the statute. But Cray had lawyers. Real ones, the kind who knew the territory and knew the judges and knew which arguments to make and when to stop making them. What this was ammunition. And the moment Cray found out he had it, everything would accelerate. He was halfway to the livery when a man stepped out of the alley between the hardware store and the barber. Not moving toward him, just stepping into the light and standing there making himself seen. It was a particular kind of move, the move of a man who wanted you to know you'd been watched without giving you the technical excuse of confrontation. He was younger than Cade by about 5 years. Square-jawed, flat-eyed, with the kind of stillness that wasn't calm, but was its close cousin. He wore his gun forward on his hip, in the way of men who wanted it noticed. "Voss," he said, just the name, no greeting in it. Cade stopped. He didn't reach for anything. He stood easy, the certified copies tucked inside his coat, and looked at the man with the patient attention he gave to problems he needed to understand before he decided how to handle them. "You have me at a disadvantage," Cade said. "Trent," the man said. "Dalton Cray sends his regards." "I'll bet he does. He also sends a message." Trent moved his weight slightly, not a threat, exactly more like an emphasis. "You belong to the past, Voss. Cray's past. He thought it was funny for about a minute you coming here marrying some ranch woman playing the straight life. But funny gets old. What does Cray want? He wants you gone, out of the territory. Take your conscience and your reformed man routine somewhere it doesn't cause complications." He paused. "He'll let the woman keep her land." Cade looked at him. "He'll let her keep it," he repeated. "For now, she's not the problem. You are. And if I don't go?" Trent's expression didn't change. "Then the 14 days become 7, and accidents happen to property, and eventually accidents happen to people." He let that settle. "Cray's not unreasonable, Voss. He's just clear." Cade was quiet for a moment. He looked at Trent the way he looked at documents, with full attention, reading what was said between the lines. "Tell Cray I heard his message," he said, and I'll give him my answer in my own time." He walked past Trent and down the street to the livery, and he felt the man's eyes on his back the whole way, and he didn't turn around because turning around was what they wanted, the acknowledgement of pressure, the first physical sign of a man who might be moved. He wasn't moved, but he was calculating. Because Cray's offer leave and she keeps her land was the kind of offer that was designed to look like mercy and function like a trap. If Cade left, Lila lost the only person who understood what she was actually facing. She lost the legal challenge he'd just built. She lost the only advantage she had, which was his knowledge of how Cray operated and where the pressure points were. And then in 6 months or a year, when the noise had died down, Cray would find another way to her land, and she'd have nothing. Cray knew that. Cray was counting on it. Cade saddled his horse and rode back to the Rafter Sea. He told Lila everything while she was at the kitchen table, with her father's ledgers still spread in front of her, and he watched her face move through the information. The way weather moved through a landscape quickly, completely, with nothing held back. When he got to the discrepancy in the filing dates, she stood up. "I have the envelope," she said. "The original, with the postmark. I kept everything." "I know. You told me. That's what makes this usable." She went to her father's desk in the front room and came back with an envelope handled carefully the way you handled evidence. She put it on the table next to the certified copies, and they looked at the 2 dates together. 9 days. 9 days was enough. "This invalidates the foreclosure action," she said. "It gives grounds to challenge it. A territorial judge would have to rule on whether the improper notification resets the clock. In most cases, they do reset it. It would buy us at least 60 days, maybe 90. And in 60 days you file for restructuring as a married couple with demonstrable income from the ranch operation, which is a different legal position than a single woman with inherited debt." He paused. "It's not guaranteed, but it's a real argument." Lila looked at the envelope and the certified copies for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "You found this in one morning," she said. "You told me exactly where to look. You knew what it meant when you found it." "Yes." She held his gaze. "Thomas was right about you." He didn't respond to that directly. He folded the certified copies back into his coat with the same care she'd given to the envelope. "There's something else. Trent." She listened to that without interruption, the message Cray's offer. When he finished, she said, "He'll let me keep the land if you leave." That's what he said. Do you believe him? No, Cade said. Not for more than it takes him to find a different approach. So do I. He looked at her. Believe him, she said. I mean, do I believe him either? I don't. She pushed the ledgers aside and put the certified copies and the envelope together in a neat stack. You told me you left Cray's operation when you were sent to ruin a man who had nothing left. A man with a wife and children. Yes. So Cray knows that's how you operate. He knows you can be moved by the right pressure. Her eyes were steady and direct. He's offering you an exit because he thinks you'll take it to protect me. He thinks you'll decide your presence is making things worse for me, and you'll do the honorable thing and go. Cade was quiet. Is that what Thomas meant? She said. About stubbornness and honor being an unusual combination? Probably. Then you already know what I'm going to say. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that she saw it. You're going to tell me to stay. I'm going to tell you we fight this together. She said it the way she'd said I do at the courthouse, without drama, with finality. I'm not trading your knowledge and the legal challenge you just built for Cray's version of mercy. I don't trust his mercy. I don't trust men who offer you what you already own and call it a gift. Something in Cade settled. Not visibly, not in any way she could have pointed to, but she felt it the way you feel the shift in a room when something that was coiled goes quiet. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They spent the rest of the afternoon building the filing strategy. Lila wrote because her handwriting was cleaner and her knowledge of the specific statutes was sharper. Cade dictated the framework from his knowledge of how territorial courts received arguments. Back and forth without wasted motion, with the focused efficiency of people who understood that time was the resource they had least of. By the time the sun was dropping, they had a petition drafted, not finished, not polished, but built the bones of a legal argument that Lila would take to Judge Pruitt first thing in the morning. She made supper. Simple again. He helped without being asked, moving around the kitchen with the practical ease of a man who had never had anyone to cook for him and had therefore learned to do it himself. She set 2 plates. He sat down, and for a few minutes in the early evening quiet, they ate without speaking. Not the uncomfortable silence of strangers, not yet the easy silence of familiarity, but something in between, the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something together in a single day and are processing what it means. Then Lila said without looking up from her plate, "Why didn't you want to come when Thomas asked you?" Cade was quiet for a moment. "Because I knew what I was," he said. "What my history was. Coming here meant bringing it with me. A woman trying to save her land doesn't need a man with my past attached to her situation. And yet you came. I promised. That's the only reason." He looked at her across the table. Thomas said. He stopped, seemed to consider. He said you sounded like someone worth knowing. He said it like it was the most important thing he wanted to tell me, and he was running out of breath. The kitchen went quiet again. Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere on the fence line, a board flexed and creaked. Then from the direction of the barn, a sound that didn't fit. A thud. Then another. Then the particular high pitch of an animal suddenly alarmed. Cade was out of his chair and through the door before Lila had finished standing. She grabbed the rifle from behind the kitchen door, her father's rifle, the one she'd learned to shoot on, the one she'd kept oiled and loaded for 2 years of nights alone on this ranch, and she followed him out. The barn door was open. 2 men she didn't recognize were inside, and one of them had a torch. The fire started the way fires always started, when they were set on purpose fast and in more than one place at the same time, so that by the time you understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop it from being serious. What happened next went very fast. Cade crossed the distance to the first man before the torch had touched the second pile of hay, and what he did to stop him was efficient and brutal and over in seconds. The second man ran. He made it as far as the fence line before Lila's voice stopped him cold. "Don't," she said. She had the rifle leveled and her feet set, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had spent 27 years watching men underestimate what she was capable of and had run completely out of patience with it. The man stopped. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 1920. He turned and looked at her, and at the rifle, and at whatever was in her face, and he made a quick and accurate calculation about his options. "Who sent you?" she said. He didn't answer. "I'm going to ask you one more time," she said, "and then I'm going to assume you work for Dalton Cray, and I'm going to tie you to the fence post and leave you there for Sheriff Bowman, and you can explain to the sheriff why you were in my barn with a torch on the day after I filed a legal challenge against his employer's fraudulent land claim." The young man looked at her. "Cray," he said. "Trent sent us." Cade came out of the barn. His knuckles were scraped. He looked at the young man at the fence line, and at Lila standing with the rifle, and at the barn behind him where the fire had been stopped, before it stopped barely the hay in one corner, charred black smoke still rising into the evening air. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Cade tied the young man to the fence post exactly as she'd promised, and went to check the barn for damage, and Lila lowered the rifle and stood in the smoky dark, and understood with perfect and unwanted clarity that Trent's message had already become Cray's answer. They hadn't waited for Cade to respond. They'd decided for him. And now the question wasn't whether the fight was coming. The question was how long they had before it arrived in full. Sheriff Bowman arrived at the Rafter C the next morning. He came alone, which told Cade something. A sheriff responding to a report of arson on a ranch property brought a deputy. He brought documentation. He brought the apparatus of official response. Bowman brought himself his horse, and an expression that sat somewhere between professionally concerned and privately exhausted the face of a man who had been doing a difficult job for too long in a place that kept making it harder. He was older than Cade had expected. 60s, maybe past them. The kind of lean that wasn't healthy, the kind that came from years of tension held in the body and never fully released. His badge was polished. That detail registered. A man who still polished his badge after this many years either had deep conviction or was compensating for the absence of it. Lila met him at the fence line. "Sheriff," she said, "thank you for coming." Mrs. P. Bowman stopped. He'd started to say Chen and caught himself. "Mrs. Voss." He looked past her to where Cade was standing near the barn, and something moved through his eyes. Recognition, and beneath that, a more complicated current that hadn't resolved itself yet. "Cade Voss, I heard you were in town." "Heard it fast," Cade said. "Small town." Bowman dismounted and tied his horse to the post with the deliberate movements of a man buying himself time to think. "I heard you got married too. Courthouse yesterday. Judge Pruitt mentioned it." "We did." Bowman looked at Lila. "Your choice, ma'am." "Entirely," she said. No warmth in it, but no hostility either. Just the plain statement of a woman who had answered this kind of question before, and would answer it as many times as necessary. The sheriff nodded. He walked to the barn and looked at the charred corner, the blackened hay, the evidence of what had been stopped barely in time. He walked without rushing, studying it with the thoroughness of a man who had made a career of reading what situations were really about, rather than what they looked like. "You catch them," he said. "One," Cade said. "Young. 19, maybe 20. Said his name was Pike. Said Trent sent him." Bowman turned. His expression hadn't changed exactly, but something behind it had tightened. "You let him go." "After he told us what we needed to know. Holding him would have cost more than it was worth without you here to take him legal." "Where is he now?" "Road south. Fast." Bowman was quiet for a moment. He looked at the charred corner again. Then he looked at Cade with an expression that was trying hard to be neutral and not quite getting there. "You know who sent them," Bowman said. "Not a question." "I know who Trent works for," Cade said. "Then you know I can't do much." He said it without apology. He also said it without satisfaction, which mattered. Cray has no presence in Dust Ridge on paper. Trent is a private citizen as far as any record shows. A frightened 19-year-old kid saying Trent sent me is not testimony that survives a territorial court. "I know," Cade said. "I'm not his man," Bowman said. And now there was something raw in it. A man clarifying something that needed clarifying even when nobody had asked. I want to be plain about that. I am not Cray's man. I didn't say you were. No, but you thought it. Cade looked at him steadily. I thought you might be in a difficult position. Something shifted in Bowman's face. The exhaustion was more visible now, the kind that accumulated not from hard work, but from the particular weight of keeping your integrity intact in a place that kept testing whether you'd sell it. Difficult is one word for it, he said. Lila, who had been listening with her arms crossed and her expression attentive, said, Sheriff, we filed a legal petition with Judge Pruitt this morning. The debt transfer on this property was improperly documented notification to the deed holder was backdated. We have the original postmarked envelope and certified copies from the county recorder's office showing the discrepancy. Bowman looked at her, then at Cade, then back at her. You filed this morning. Before breakfast, she said, and the barn fire was last night. Yes. He understood the sequence. She could see him understanding it the way a man who had spent decades reading situations let this one settle into its real shape. The fire wasn't random intimidation. It was a response. Which meant Cray's people knew about the filing before it happened, or had been watching closely enough to respond to the marriage itself as a provocation. Judge Pruitt will hear it, Bowman said. He's reviewing the filing today, Lila said. If he accepts jurisdiction, there'll be a hearing within 10 days. 10 days is a long time, Bowman said, and the way he said it communicated clearly that he thought something else might happen in those 10 days, and he wasn't sure what he could do about it. We know, Cade said. Bowman put his hat back on. He looked at the barn one more time, and then at Lila's face, and then at the flat plain of the ranch, stretching out in every direction, the land her father had worked. The land Cray wanted, the land this whole impossible situation was built around. I'll increase my ride-bys, he said. Can't promise more than that, but I'll be visible. I appreciate it, Lila said. He mounted up. He was almost to the road when he turned back. He looked at Cade specifically, and there was something in his face now that was neither official nor comfortable, something personal, something that had been waiting for the right moment, and had apparently decided this was it. Voss, he said. Sheriff, the man you were before I knew him by reputation, knew some of what he did for Cray. A pause. The man I'm looking at right now is different. I can see that. I just need to know. He stopped, chose words carefully. Are you staying, or is this a situation where you calculate the cost and decide it's too high? The question landed in the open air between them. Lila didn't look at Cade. She looked at the road beyond Bowman, at the horizon, at nothing specific, giving him the space to answer without the weight of her watching. I'm staying, Cade said. Bowman nodded once, turned his horse, rode south toward town. They stood and watched him go, and the quiet that settled after the hoofbeats faded was different from the quiet. Before he'd arrived, heavier, more inhabited by things that hadn't been said out loud. He's not going to be enough, Lila said. No. Cade agreed. So what do we do for 10 days? We prepare, and we don't wait for them to come to us. She turned to look at him. What does that mean? It means we go find out what Cray is actually planning. Not the fire that was a message. Messages are easy. What comes after the message is what matters. He looked at her with the directness she'd come to expect from him, the quality she'd initially experienced as coldness, and now understood was something else: respect. The refusal to soften things that didn't deserve softening. Cray has a local operation, not just Trent's visible, which means he's not the whole picture. There's someone in Dust Ridge managing the ground level work, someone at the bank or the land office or both. Harlan Dowd, Lila said immediately. Cade looked at her. The banker, she said. He was accommodating is the wrong word. He was smooth. Every time I came in to discuss the debt, he was smooth in a way that felt like he already knew how the conversation would end. Like he was performing patience. She paused. He also told me the debt had been sold, but wouldn't say to whom. He said the new holder preferred privacy. Preferred privacy, Cade repeated. I thought it was unusual at the time. Now it seems obvious. Dowd may not be Cray's man in the way Trent is. He may just be a man who found it profitable to be convenient. Cade was thinking out loud now, the careful, deliberate thinking out loud of someone who worked problems methodically. But he would have facilitated the transfer. He would have the original transfer documents, if there's more fraud than we already found. There's more, Lila said with a certainty that surprised him. How do you know? Because the backdated notification was too easy. It was the kind of mistake you make when you're moving fast, and you think the person on the other end isn't going to fight back. She looked at him. Cray didn't think I would fight back. He bought my debt, expecting a quiet foreclosure on a woman alone. Every shortcut he took was built on that assumption. Cade looked at her for a long moment. Then we look for the shortcuts, he said. Yes, she said. We do. They went inside and sat at the kitchen table, where the ledgers and the certified copies and the original postmarked envelope still lived, and they built a list. Every date, every document name, every point in the transfer process where a man in a hurry might have cut a corner because he thought it didn't matter, because the woman at the end of the paperwork was supposed to give up before she got to the part where the corners showed. It took 2 hours. By the end of it, they had 7 specific documents to verify. 7 points in the chain where something might be wrong. They had 10 days. It was enough if nothing else went sideways. 3 days passed. They were the strangest 3 days of Lila Chen's life, and given the week that had preceded them, that was a significant statement. The strangeness wasn't dramatic. It was the ordinary strangeness of 2 people learning to occupy the same space, learning each other's rhythms, which was the word she kept coming back to because it was the most accurate one. Cade rose before her always, and made coffee, always, and was outside before full light doing a perimeter check she hadn't asked him to do and hadn't needed to ask. He worked the ranch with the focused competence of a man who had done physical labor his whole life and knew how to read what needed doing without being directed. He fixed the fence post she'd been meaning to get to for 2 months. He checked the water line from the well to the stock trough and found a slow leak she hadn't noticed. He didn't announce these things, he just did them. She found herself recalibrating, which was uncomfortable in the particular way that necessary recalibrations always were. She had been alone on this ranch for 2 years. She had learned to account for herself and only herself, to measure effort against her own capacity to make decisions in the clean solitude of no one else's opinion. Now there was a person, a real present daily person with weight and habits and a way of moving through a space that she was mapping without meaning to. He knocked before he came in at the end of the day. Every time, even though it was her house and she'd never asked him to. She noticed that. On the 3rd evening, she asked him about it. They were at the kitchen table after supper. They'd fallen into the habit of staying at the table after eating over coffee, going through the document list, or talking through strategy, or sometimes just sitting in the kind of quiet that had stopped feeling like silence and started feeling like something else, and she set down her cup and said, "You knock every time." He looked up. Seemed right. "It's your home too, legally speaking." "Legally speaking," he said. "A lot of things are true that aren't actually true yet." She held his gaze. "What does that mean?" "It means a piece of paper doesn't make a home. You've been alone here for 2 years. That deserves—" He paused in the way he paused when he was choosing words with particular care. "That deserves more respect than I just walk in." Lila looked at him. She didn't have an immediate response, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who ran out of responses. She turned her coffee cup in her hands and looked at the grain of the table and felt something shift in the careful architecture she'd built around this situation. The legal arrangement, the practical alliance, the clean transactional lines she'd drawn on day 1, because clean lines were what she could manage. "Thomas was right," she said, "about the stubbornness and the honor thing." Something moved across his face. Not grief exactly. Grief would have been too simple and too legible. More like the particular expression of a man confronted by an absence he hadn't fully accounted for yet. He missed Thomas. She could see it plainly for the first time. He'd been careful not to show it, which was its own kind of information. "He talked about you too," Cade said, "before I agreed to come. He described you and then said..." He stopped. "What did he say?" A pause. "He said you were the kind of woman who would make whoever ended up next to you want to be better than they were." He meant it as a compliment. He also meant it as a warning. A warning. That you'd hold people to a standard. That you wouldn't pretend. Something quiet in his eyes. He was right about that too. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the wind had died. The territory at night had its full weight on that absolute dark, that particular silence that was never quite silent if you listened for the small sounds inside it. Lila said, "He would have been good for this place." "Yes," Cade said. "He would have been." "Are you..." He held her gaze without flinching. "I don't know yet. I'm trying to find out." She nodded slowly. That was, she thought, the most honest answer he could have given, and honesty was the currency she'd decided to trade in from the moment she'd agreed to this. "Go check the perimeter," she said. "I'll do the dishes." He went. She did the dishes, and somewhere in the middle of drying her father's plates, she realized she'd stopped thinking of Cade Voss as a complication and started thinking of him as a fact. The way the land was a fact. The way the debt was a fact. Something real, present, and consequential that she was going to have to decide what to do with eventually. Not yet. But eventually. On day 4, Judge Prewitt's clerk came to the ranch with a message the judge had reviewed the filing and was inclined to accept jurisdiction. A formal hearing was set for 9 days hence. Both parties, Lila as the debtor and Territorial Resources Consolidated as the debt holder, would be required to appear or send legal representation. Lila read the message twice. Then she went to find Cade. He was in the barn working on the harness that had been cracked since before she could remember. He looked up when she came in and read her face before she said a word. "Good or bad?" he said. "Good," Prewitt accepted. "Hearing in 9 days." Something in Cade's face shifted toward relief, but he didn't let it land fully. She was beginning to understand that he processed good news the same way he processed bad, with the caution of a man who had learned that things could always get worse, and that celebration was a luxury you earned after the fact. "They'll send a lawyer," he said. "Cray has territorial lawyers on retainer, real ones." "I know. We need someone to argue our side. Judge Prewitt is fair, but he's not going to let you argue your own case effectively against a professional." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Do you know any lawyers from before?" He thought about it. 1. A man named Garvey Abel Garvey. He practiced in the territory for 20 years before Cray made it too uncomfortable for him. He moved east, but last I knew, he was in Pueblo. Would he come for this? If he knew what it was about, who it was against, he might. Something that wasn't quite a smile, the movement at the corner of his mouth that she'd stopped misreading as nothing. Garvey and Cray have history. Cray had him run out of the territory for defending a case Cray wanted dismissed. Garvey is not a man who forgets being run out of anywhere. "Can you reach him?" "Telegram. Today." "Do it," she said. He went. She stayed in the barn for a moment after he left, in the smell of hay and horse and the faint char from the fire that still lived in the back corner. And she looked at her father's harness being repaired with the careful attention of a man who had never been asked to do it. She put her hand on the repaired leather. Her father had bought this harness the year she was born. She was not going to lose this ranch. She went back to the house and picked up her pen. The telegram to Abel Garvey in Pueblo went out that afternoon. The reply came the next morning, and it said in the compressed language of telegraph communication something that Lila read aloud to Cade while he was drinking his morning coffee, and that made him set the cup down. Voss. Stop. Dalton. Cray. Stop. I will be there. Stop. Garvey. She looked up from the paper. Cade was almost smiling. She was nearly certain of it. "He's coming," she said. "He's coming," Cade agreed, And then, three things happened in very quick succession that unraveled the particular fragile relief of that moment. The first was that Trent came to the ranch. Not with men this time. Alone, which was its own kind of statement. The move of a man who wanted to have a conversation without the appearance of threat, which was itself a form of threat. He rode up to the fence line and stopped there without coming through the gate, which was the frontier equivalent of a calling card, and he waited. Cade went to the fence. Lila came with him, and when he looked at her briefly, the look that said, "You don't have to be here." She shook her head once and stood her ground, which he accepted without argument. "Voss?" Trent said. His eyes moved to Lila. "Mrs. Voss." The title carried something in it, an acknowledgement that was also an assessment. "Cray wants a conversation." "He can come have one," Cade said. "He prefers to be represented. He's being represented in court in 9 days. That's the conversation." Something tightened in Trent's face, the involuntary expression of a man who had delivered a message and had it declined and didn't like how it reflected on him. "Cray says the hearing is unnecessary. He says if you withdraw the filing, the debt terms reset to 60 days with no interest accumulation. He says Mrs. Voss keeps her home. And we keep our legal challenge," Lila said before Cade could speak, "and the documented evidence of fraud, and the certified copies from the county recorder's office." She held Trent's gaze with the same steady patience she'd used on the 19-year-old boy at the fence line 3 nights ago. "Tell Cray we aren't interested in new terms. Tell him we'll see him or his lawyer at the hearing." Trent looked at her for a long moment. There was something behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read. Not respect exactly, but a recalibration. The same look Cade had given her on the first morning when she'd laid out the statutory framework. The look of a man updating his assessment. "You understand what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Completely," she said. Trent looked at Cade. "She always liked this." "Getting that way," Cade said. Trent turned his horse and rode south without another word. The second thing that happened was Sheriff Bowman came back, and this time he was not alone, and his expression was not the tired professionalism of his first visit. He had a younger man with him, a deputy young enough that his badge looked new, and the exhaustion in Bowman's face had deepened into something that looked like it had been sitting with him for a sleepless night. He didn't dismount. "I need to speak with Cade Voss," he said. "Privately." Lila didn't move. "Lila," Cade said quietly. "Whatever you need to say to my husband," she said with a calm and absolute finality, "you can say to me." Bowman looked at her. Something in his face adjusted not irritation, but resignation, the adjustment of a man who had come prepared to manage a conversation a certain way and was discovering that the conversation was going to manage itself. He dismounted. He told them. Cray had filed a counterclaim through his territorial lawyers, filed that morning, in the Territorial District Court, bypassing Judge Pruitt's jurisdiction entirely. The counterclaim alleged that Lila's petition was fraudulent, that the postmark discrepancy she was using as evidence had been manufactured, that the envelope had been tampered with, that the certified copies from the recorder's office had been obtained under false pretenses. "He's claiming I fabricated the evidence," Lila said. "His lawyers are claiming it," Bowman said. "There's a difference. In court." "Not enough of one," Cade said. "No," Bowman admitted. "Not nearly enough." He took his hat off and held it. The gesture of a man with something difficult left to say. "There's more. The counterclaim names you Voss specifically. It alleges you coerced Miss Chen. He caught himself, Mrs. Voss, into marriage under false pretenses for the purpose of fraudulent land claim manipulation. It alleges you have a documented history of operating outside the law on behalf of criminal interests." The air in the yard went very cold. Lila's voice was completely level. "He's going after Cade's history with him, using it as a weapon." "Yes." "To discredit the marriage and the filing." "Yes." Cade said nothing. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone to that particular quality she'd seen on the platform in the first minute, dark, steady, burning quietly. "If the counterclaim holds..." Bowman said it transfers jurisdiction from Prewitt to the district court, which is in Denver, which is where Cray has considerably more influence, Cade said. Yes. Lila turned to Cade. Can Garvey address the counterclaim? If he gets here in time. When does the counterclaim require a response? 7 days, Bowman said. 7 days instead of 9. And a different court, a different jurisdiction, and an allegation that turned their evidence into a liability, because now proving the backdated document meant proving they hadn't fabricated the proof, which was a harder thing to prove than a simple date discrepancy. Cray was not a stupid man. She had known that. But knowing it abstractly and experiencing it in motion were different things. The third thing that happened came after Bowman left, and it was the most unexpected of all. Cade came into the house while she was at the table with the document list, revising timelines, recalculating. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He'd stopped knocking when he came in during the day, which she'd noticed without comment, which seemed to mean something, and he said her name once quietly. She looked up. His face was different. Not distressed, that was too dramatic a word and too legible a read for Cade Voss. But open in a way she hadn't seen before. The quality of something long held finally being put down. I need to tell you something, he said. Something I should have told you before the courthouse. She set down her pen. Sit down, she said. He sat. The reason Cray can use my history against me, he said, the reason it works as a legal argument is that there's a documented case. 2 years before I walked away from Cray's operation. A man named Rourke. He owed Cray money. Real money, not the manufactured debt he puts on land. He wants real contracted debt from a business deal that went wrong. I was sent to collect. He paused. Rourke didn't have it. He had property, a mill north of here. Cray wanted the mill. I helped structure the... Another pause. Longer. I helped make it legal. On paper. The transfer of the mill from Rourke to Cray's holding company. I didn't put hands on anyone. I didn't threaten anyone directly. But I knew what I was doing, and I did it, and the paperwork I helped with is in the territorial record under my name. Lila looked at him. You helped Cray steal a mill, she said. Yes. 2 years before you walked away. Yes. And you didn't tell me this before I filed a legal challenge that is now being answered with an allegation of fraudulent land manipulation that specifically references your documented history with Cray's property transfers. He held her gaze without flinching. No, I didn't tell you. Why? Because I thought I could protect the challenge without surfacing that record. I thought Cray would fight the dating discrepancy directly, rather than going after the filer. His jaw was set, but his eyes were honest, the particular honesty of a man who had miscalculated and was not going to dress it as anything else. I was wrong, and that's on me. Lila sat with it. She did not reach for easy anger, though it was available. She did not perform betrayal, though the feeling was present, a specific kind of hurt, not personal, but the hurt of someone who had taken a calculated risk on a person's honesty and found out the calculation had been incomplete. She thought about Thomas Garrett saying the most stubborn and most honorable man I've ever met. She thought about the fact that Thomas, who had been a careful man, had believed this. She thought about the fact that Cade had come here at all, had walked into a situation he'd known would cost him, had carried a dead man's promise through a train journey and a courthouse and 3 days of fence repair and document review, and Trent's visits, had told her everything else without editing, and had held this one thing back. Not to deceive her, to protect her from it. Which was, she thought, exactly the kind of honor that looked like stubbornness from the outside. What does Garvey need to counter it? She said. Cade blinked. He'd been prepared for something else. She could see it, the slight recalibration of a man who had braced for a blow and received a question instead. He needs the Rourke case record, Cade said carefully, and he needs a way to contextualize my involvement to show it as coerced cooperation rather than voluntary participation. There's a man who knows the truth of it. A witness who was present when Cray gave me the Rourke assignment. A man named Declan Price. He left Cray's operation before I did. He's been living quiet in New Mexico. Can we reach him? I can try. Then try, she said. She picked up her pen. And next time, whatever you're holding back because you think it'll frighten me, tell me first. I can't fight something I can't see. He was quiet for a moment. You're not angry, he said, like it surprised him. I'm angry, she said. I'm angry in the way I'm angry at the bank and at Cray and at every man who's looked at this land and thought it was easier to take than to earn. She looked up at him. But being angry at you doesn't help me keep my father's ranch. So I'm putting it where it's useful and moving forward. Cade looked at her for a long time. Thomas was right, he said, about all of it. Send the telegram to Declan Price, she said, and write down everything you remember about the Rourke transfer, every detail. Garvey will need it. He went. She went back to the document list. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening, and the ranch was quiet in the particular way it had been quiet her whole life. Not peaceful exactly, but present. Alive with the small sounds of land and livestock and wind. Her father's ranch. Her mother's dress hanging in the wardrobe. Thomas Garrett's letters in the desk. A man named Cade Voss sending telegrams from the Dust Ridge office on her behalf, carrying the weight of two promises, now one to a dead man and one to a living woman who had told him she needed the whole truth. She had been alone on this land for 2 years. She had not known what she was missing. She wasn't sure she could call it comfort. Not yet. Not with Cray's counterclaim sitting in a Denver court and 7 days on the clock and more fight ahead than behind. But something. Something real and present and consequential, growing in the space between two people who had chosen for different reasons, on different terms, to stand in the same place. The evening came, and then, just after dark, the sound of a horse coming hard up the road from town. Not Cade's measured approach, but urgent, the stride of someone riding with news that couldn't wait. Lila had the rifle in her hand before the rider reached the gate. It was the young telegraph clerk from town. 17 years old, out of breath, holding an envelope. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "this just came in. Mr. Voss said to bring it direct if anything came from Pueblo." She took the envelope. She opened it. She read it. She stood in the dark with the rifle in one hand and the telegram in the other, and felt the night press in from all sides. The telegram was from Abel Garvey. It said, "Cannot come, stop, warned off, stop. 3 men visited my office today. Stop, Cray's men, stop, I am sorry, stop, Garvey." Lila read it twice. She sent the clerk back to town. She stood alone at the gate of her father's ranch, with the telegram in her hand, and she looked at the dark road going south toward Dust Ridge. And she thought about what Cray had just done, had reached into Pueblo, into another man's office, into their last legal resource, and had closed it. Before they even got started. She heard Cade's horse before she saw him coming back from the telegraph office riding at his usual measured pace. That was about to become very different. She waited for him. He saw her face when he reached the gate. "What happened?" he said. She handed him the telegram. He read it. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Cade folded the telegram, with the same precision he gave to everything, tucked it into his coat, and looked at Lila with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled neutrality, not the careful steadiness. Something harder. Something that had been under all of it the whole time, and had just reached the surface. "He doesn't want the court," Cade said. "He's trying to make sure there is no court." "I know," Lila said. "Which means we're out of legal options, for now." "I know that too." She looked at him. "So what do we have?" she said. He held her gaze. "Each other?" he said. "And everything we know about how Cray operates." A pause. "And the fact that he doesn't know yet how much that is." The night was very dark. The ranch was very quiet, and Lila Chen looked at the man she'd married in a courthouse 2 days ago for purely practical reasons, and she thought that Thomas Garrett, who had died in a mountain camp with this man beside him, might have known exactly what he was doing. She didn't say it, but she thought it. "Come inside," she said. "We have work to do." They worked through the night. Not frantically, Lila had learned in 2 years of running a ranch alone that panic was the most expensive thing you could spend your energy on, and Cade appeared to have learned the same lesson somewhere in his harder history. They worked the way people work when they understand that the clock is real, and the only answer to it is to be more thorough than the people who set it. She made fresh coffee. He spread everything they had across the kitchen table. The certified copies, the original envelope, the document list, the Garvey telegram, and a new sheet of paper on which he began writing from memory every detail of the Rourke Mill transfer 2 years ago. Names, dates, amounts, the specific language Cray's intermediaries had used, the notary who'd stamped the papers, the recorder's office where it had been filed. Lila read over his shoulder and asked questions, sharp ones, the kind that made him back up and fill in gaps he hadn't thought were gaps. "Who witnessed the Rourke transfer?" she said. "Cray's man on paper. A man named Aldrich. But Declan Price was in the room. And Price left Cray's operation when, about 8 months after the Rourke job, something happened, I don't know exactly what. Cray sent men after him, which is how I knew he'd left without permission. I heard Price had settled in New Mexico, small ranch outside Santa Fe." "Did you send that telegram tonight, before Garvey's message came?" Cade looked up. "Yes, sent it before I came back. So we wait for his answer." "If Cray's reach goes to Pueblo," Cade said carefully, "it goes to Santa Fe. Then we need Price to already be moving before Cray knows we asked." She straightened up and looked at the document list. "If Price can't come or won't, what else do we have?" Cade was quiet for a moment. He was doing the thing she'd learned to recognize, not hesitating, but processing. Running the full architecture of a problem before he spoke about any single piece of it. "The Rourke case record is in the Territorial Archive," he said. "My name is on it as a participant in the transfer. Cray's lawyers will use that to say I have a documented pattern of fraudulent land manipulation. Garvey would have argued context that I was acting under Cray's direction, not independently. Without Garvey, we need someone else to make that argument." "Judge Pruitt," Lila said. Cade looked at her. "Pruitt accepted our filing," she said. "He's already looked at the evidence. Cray went to the district court to avoid him, which means Pruitt is the judge Cray doesn't want, which means Pruitt might be willing to fight for his jurisdiction." She paused. "He was a territorial lawyer for 20 years before he became a judge. He knows how to argue. If we can convince him that Cray's counterclaim is jurisdictional manipulation, which it is, Pruitt can't argue a case he's also judging," Cade said. "No, but he can file a jurisdictional challenge from the bench. He can formally contest the district court's right to supersede his proceeding. That buys time, and it puts Cray's lawyers in a position they didn't plan for, defending their own legal maneuver instead of attacking ours." She looked at him steadily. "Cray built his counterclaim assuming we'd be scrambling. He didn't build it assuming the local judge would fight back." The kitchen was very quiet. Cade looked at her with that expression she'd seen now enough times to know the recalibration, the revision of a map. "You've been thinking about this since the telegram came," he said. "I've been thinking about it since Trent's first visit," she said. "I knew Cray would come at us sideways. Men who want land never come straight at the person standing on it. They come at the paperwork. And you know how to fight the paperwork." "I know how my father lost ground to paperwork for 20 years, she said. "I know every place it hurts and why." "Yes." Cade set down his pen. He looked at her across the table, across the spread of documents and coffee cups, and 2 years of her father's debt, and 4 days of their combined effort, and whatever calculation he'd been running since the train platform came to a conclusion she could see arrive in his face. "In the morning," he said, "we go to Pruitt." "In the morning," she agreed. She went to bed at 2. He kept watch as he always did. She didn't argue anymore. She'd learned that the watch wasn't about distrust of her capability or of the night. It was about the fact that he slept lighter than she did, and woke faster, and had the particular trained instinct of a man who had spent years knowing that the moment you stopped watching was the moment something happened. She lay in her father's small room and listened to the house settle and thought about Declan Price in Santa Fe and about whether Cray's reach was as long as they feared, and about the specific angle of Cade's handwriting on the document list, precise and compressed, each letter fully formed, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write carefully because careless writing in the work he'd done could cost someone everything. She thought about Thomas Garrett saying he wanted her to be taken care of. She thought that Thomas, who had been a careful man, might have sent exactly the right person for reasons Thomas himself only partially understood. She fell asleep on that thought. The morning came fast. Judge Prewitt's office was at the back of the courthouse behind the courtroom itself, a room crowded with law books and territorial records, and the accumulated paper of a legal career that had started before Colorado was a state. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, in a way that surprised people who expected judges to be trim, with the careful and attentive eyes of someone who had spent decades listening to people tell him things and sorting truth from construction. He looked at Cade Voss across his desk with the frankness of a man who had already done his own research. "I know who you are," he said. "I know your history with Cray." "Then you know Cray's counterclaim is designed to use that history as a weapon," Cade said. "I know what it looks like," Prewitt said carefully. "What I need to know is whether the underlying claim, the backdated notification, is solid. Because if it's solid, everything else is noise." Lila put the postmarked envelope on his desk. Then the certified copies. Then her written account dated and signed of every communication she'd received regarding the debt transfer with specific dates from her own records. Prewitt read everything. He read it the way Cade read things fully, without skimming, with the focused attention of a man for whom details were the whole point. He set it down. 9 days, he said. "That's the discrepancy." "Yes," Lila said. "And you have the original envelope?" "Yes." "And the certified copies from Aldous Fitch at the recorder's office, who you say was unaware of the discrepancy?" "Fitch didn't know," Cade said. "His reaction when I found it was genuine surprise. Whatever was filed with his office was filed by Cray's people before Fitch had reason to scrutinize it." Prewitt leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man assembling a complex picture. "Cray's lawyers filed in district court yesterday morning. The counterclaim is procedurally valid. They have the right to challenge jurisdiction. What they don't have the right to do is file simultaneously in 2 courts without disclosure, which they did not provide." Lila sat forward. "They didn't disclose our existing proceeding. They filed their counterclaim as an original action. They did not reference your prior filing with my court." Prewitt's voice was still careful, still measured, but underneath it, something had sharpened. "That is at minimum a procedural irregularity. At most, it is deliberate concealment of a competing proceeding, which is a sanctionable offense." Cade and Lila looked at each other. "That gives you grounds," Cade said to Prewitt, "to contest the district court's jurisdiction, not just the right, the obligation." "It gives me grounds," Prewitt said, "to file a formal judicial notice with the district court, advising them that a prior proceeding exists in my jurisdiction and that their filing may be procedurally defective." He paused. "It does not guarantee anything. The district court can still rule in Cray's favor, but it puts the burden on his lawyers to explain why they didn't disclose, which is an uncomfortable burden when the answer is that they deliberately chose not to." "How long does that process take?" Lila asked. "Filing the notice today, which I am prepared to do, gives the district court 10 days to respond before any further action on the counterclaim can proceed." He looked at her steadily. 10 days, Mrs. Voss. 10 days. They'd started with 14. They'd lost some to the fire, and Trent's visits, and the back and forth of Cray's legal maneuvering. Now they had 10 days in which Prewitt's judicial notice would freeze the district court action, and in those 10 days, they needed either Declan Price or some equivalent leverage. "Do it," Lila said. Prewitt nodded. He pulled a sheet of official paper from his desk drawer and uncapped his pen. They left the courthouse 40 minutes later with Prewitt's notice filed and a copy in Lila's hand, and she stood on the courthouse steps in the same spot where 4 days ago she had walked away from a marriage ceremony with Cade, half a step behind her. And she felt the difference between then and now, as a physical thing. Not confidence exactly, but traction. The feeling of ground that held when you put weight on it. We bought time, she said. We bought time, Cade agreed. Now we need Price. They got his answer that afternoon. The telegraph clerk came to the ranch again. He was developing a habit of it. This boy and Lila had started leaving a coin on the gatepost for him, so he didn't have to knock, and he brought a telegram from Santa Fe. Lila read it standing at the fence line. She read it twice. Then she walked to the barn where Cade was finishing the harness repair. The final piece, the buckle that had been cracked since before her father died, and she handed it to him without speaking. He read it. Voss. Stop, been waiting for this. Stop, have documents you don't know about. Stop. Rourke wasn't the only one. Stop arriving, Dustridge. Thursday. Stop, tell no one. Stop, Price. Cade looked up from the telegram. His face had the quality she'd seen on the morning he found the backdated filing, the recognition of something larger than expected, the rapid recalculation of what they were actually dealing with. Documents he has, she said. What does that mean? Price was Cray's bookkeeper before he was his enforcer, Cade said. I didn't know that. He managed the accounting on Cray's legitimate operations, the holding companies, the land acquisitions, the freight contracts. He stopped. Something in his expression shifted toward something she could only call dangerous hope. If Price kept records, Rourke wasn't the only one, Lila said. They looked at each other. He has a pattern, Cade said. Price has documentation of a pattern. Multiple land acquisitions using the same methods backdated filings manufactured debt fraudulent transfer paperwork. Which means our case isn't just about my ranch, Lila said slowly. It's about a systematic criminal operation, which changes what a territorial judge can do with it. Cade's voice was still controlled, but the current underneath it had shifted. A single fraudulent foreclosure is a civil matter. A documented pattern of fraud across multiple properties and jurisdictions is a criminal complaint to the Territorial Attorney General. The silence between them held the full weight of that. Cray had sent men to frighten Garvey and Pueblo. He'd built a counterclaim designed to discredit their evidence and bury Cade's credibility. He'd moved fast and applied pressure from multiple directions because he was a man who had always won by controlling all the angles before anyone else knew the game had started. He didn't know about Price. He didn't know Price had kept records. And Price was arriving Thursday, which was 2 days away. Tell no one, Lila said, reading the telegram again. No one. Cade agreed. Not even Bowman. He met her eyes. Not yet. She nodded. She folded the telegram and put it in her pocket close to her body, the same place she'd been keeping the postmarked envelope since the day Cade found the discrepancy. Thursday was 2 days away. Cray had been patient for months because he'd thought the fruit would fall without effort. He was no longer patient. The barn fire. Trent's visits, the counterclaim, the pressure on Garvey. All of it said a man who had decided to close his hand before something slipped through. 2 days was a long time to wait when a man like that was closing his hand. The next day was quiet in the way that Lila had learned to distrust. She went about the ranch work with Cade, moving parallel to her the routine of the place, the animals and the water and the fences, and they talked about practical things and did not talk about Price or Thursday or the documents that might change everything, because some things got heavier if you handled them too much before the moment came. She was feeding the horses when Bowman rode up. His face told her before he opened his mouth. I need to speak with your husband, he said. He's at the well, she said. I'll get him. She went to the well. She told Cade with her eyes before she said a word, the same way he'd been reading her face since the first morning. He came. They stood in the yard, the three of them, and Bowman said what he'd come to say. Harlan Dowd had left Dustridge, packed his personal belongings from his office at the bank the previous evening, settled his affairs, locked his desk, handed the branch keys to his assistant, and ridden north before dawn. No notice, no forwarding address. He knew, Lila said. He knew something was coming, Bowman said. Men don't clear their desks and leave without notice unless they're running from something or running to something. Given everything. He stopped. He looked at Cade carefully. Given what I know about the situation, I'd say Cray told Dowd to make himself scarce. Cray is pulling his visible pieces back, Cade said. Or protecting them, Bowman said. Lila thought about what Dowd's departure meant. The banker had been the local mechanism, the man who had managed the original debt, facilitated the transfer, kept the face of legitimate banking on Cray's land acquisition. With Dowd gone, that mechanism was gone, which meant Cray was shifting his approach. He's not going to wait for the court, she said. Both men looked at her. He pulled Dowd because he doesn't need him anymore. The legal approach, the debt, the foreclosure, the counterclaim, he's used it to buy time and apply pressure and discredit us. But he knows we're not giving up. He knows we found the discrepancy and Prewitt filed the jurisdictional notice, and he knows. She stopped. Something cold moved through her. He knows about Prewitt. Cray has eyes in this town, Bowman said quietly. Then he knows our legal position is stronger than he planned for, Cade said. Which means he's considering something other than the courts. What does that mean? Bowman said, though he asked it like a man who already knew. It means Thursday matters more than we thought, Cade said. And it means the next 48 hours are the most dangerous. Bowman's jaw set. He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man at the edge of his own decision, weighing what he'd been careful to avoid against what he couldn't anymore. Tell me what you need from me, he said. Cade looked at him. I need you to be visibly present, Cade said. In town, not here. If Cray's people see the sheriff watching our gate, they'll know we're expecting something. I need them to think we don't know it's coming. And if it does come, then it comes, Cade said, and we deal with it. Bowman looked at Lila. You understand what he's saying. He's saying we use ourselves as bait, she said. Yes, I understand. And you agree. She held Bowman's gaze with the same steady directness she'd been holding everyone's gaze with for 5 days, and she thought about her father working this land for 30 years, and Thomas Garrett dying in a mountain camp trying to make sure it was protected, and Cade Voss stepping off a train into a life he hadn't planned because he'd made a promise to a dying man, and honor didn't give him the option of breaking it. I agree, she said. Bowman left. She and Cade stood in the yard in the afternoon light and looked at each other, and the thing that had been growing between them, the thing that was not quite trust yet, and not quite something more, the thing they hadn't named because naming it would have required a kind of attention they couldn't spare, was very present in that moment, not comfortable, not romantic. Something rawer than either of those. The presence of two people who had come to depend on each other in the specific, undecorated way that shared danger created. If Price has what he says he has, Lila said, and we can get him to Prewitt, then Cray's entire operation is exposed, Cade said. Not just the claim on your land, all of it. That's why he's moving now, she said. He doesn't know about Price, but he knows we're more dangerous than he planned for, and he's trying to end it before it gets bigger. Yes. She looked at him. Are you afraid? He considered it, which she respected. He never answered questions about his inner state reflexively, which had initially read as evasion and now read as honesty. No, he said. I've been afraid. When Thomas was dying and there was nothing I could do. When I was riding here on the train, not knowing if any of this was the right choice. He paused. Right now I'm clear, which is different from afraid. Clear, she repeated. I know what I'm defending, he said. That makes it simple. Not easy. Simple. She held his gaze for a moment. Thomas said you saved his life twice, she said. He exaggerated. He wasn't an exaggerating man. Something moved across Cade's face, that not quite smile, the small private thing that she'd been cataloging without meaning to. No, he said. He wasn't. Then I'm glad you were there, she said. When he needed you. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The answer was in the fact that he was here standing in her yard, with her land behind him and the fight in front of him, and no requirement on earth other than a dead man's promise to make him stay. The night came without incident, and then Thursday arrived. Declan Price was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture from Cade's sparse descriptions, a former enforcer and bookkeeper, a man who'd left Cray's operation under pressure, who'd been living quiet in New Mexico. She'd expected someone like Cade contained economical, the worn-down look of a man who carried things. Price was 50, maybe older, with a round open face, and the hands of a man who'd been doing physical work for years, and the eyes of someone who'd spent a long time being very careful, and had recently, in the last few miles of the ride to Dust Ridge, decided he was finished being careful. He brought a saddlebag. Inside the saddlebag was a leather document case latched with the initials DCP stamped into the leather. He put it on Lila's kitchen table and looked at Cade and said, "You look worse than the last time I saw you." "You look better," Cade said. "New Mexico suits me." He sat down. "Mrs. Voss?" He nodded at Lila with the directness of a man who didn't waste time on ceremony when the situation had already provided plenty of context. "Your husband pulled me out of a box canyon in 1877. I've been waiting for the chance to return the favor." "He didn't mention that," Lila said. "He wouldn't." Price unlatched the document case. "I have 4 years of records, every land acquisition Cray made through Territorial Resources Consolidated and his other holding companies. Every backdated filing, every fraudulent transfer, every notary who was paid to stamp documents he shouldn't have stamped." He spread the first set of papers across the table. Rourke was the third. There were 9 before him, and at least 6 after. 14 properties total across 3 counties and 2 territories. Lila looked at the papers. They were meticulous, organized by date and property. Each transaction documented with originals, not copies originals, of the fraudulent filings, cross-referenced with dates and names and amounts. The accounting records of a systematic criminal operation laid out with the care of a man who had understood what he was looking at and had kept everything against the day he'd need it. "Why did you keep these?" she said. Price looked at her. "Because I was part of it," he said simply. "Not as much as some, more than I should have been. I kept the records because—" He stopped. "Because a man needs to know what he's done, and because I thought someday someone would ask." "Cray will know you came," Cade said. "Cray already knows I left New Mexico. His people were watching my place. I left 2 days early through the back of the property." Price's expression was calm. "I'm done running from Dalton Cray. I ran far enough and long enough, and I'm 51 years old, and I'm tired." Something passed between the two men. Not words, not anything visible. The particular communication of people who had known each other in circumstances that left marks. "Prewitt," Lila said. "We take this to Prewitt today." "And the Territorial Attorney General," Cade said. "We file a criminal complaint at the same time. Prewitt handles the civil proceeding, your land, the debt, the jurisdictional challenge. The Attorney General handles the pattern." "Split their attention," Price said, nodding. "Cray's lawyers can cover one front. 2 fronts at once with this volume of documentation." He gestured at the spread of papers. "They'd need an army." "He has lawyers," Cade said. "We have 14 properties worth of fraud," Price said. "Documented, original paperwork, witnesses." He looked at Cade. "I'm a witness. To the Rourke transfer and 3 others I personally handled the accounting for." Lila stood up. "How long to copy the most critical documents? The ones for Prewitt's proceeding specifically?" "An hour," Price said. "Maybe less." "Then we start now." They copied. Lila wrote. Price dictated the accounting notations that contextualized each document. Cade organized the sequence, building the argument in the order a judge would need to receive it. The 3 of them worked around that kitchen table with the focused efficiency of people who understood exactly what they were building and why it mattered. They were an hour in when the sound came from outside. Not horses, not the approach of riders, something different. The sound of movement, multiple points of it surrounding. Cade was at the door before Lila finished registering what the sound meant. He looked back at her. "Get the rifle," he said. "I have it," she said. She already did. Price stood up from the table. He looked at the document case, at everything in it, the 4 years of records, the original paperwork that was the whole weight of what they'd built. He latched it, handed it to Lila. "Whatever happens," he said, "that goes to Prewitt." "Nothing's happening yet," Cade said. But his hand was at his side, and outside in the still afternoon the sound of movement had stopped. Which was worse. Lila stood with the rifle in one hand and the document case in the other and looked at the two men in her kitchen. Price at the table, Cade at the door, and she felt the full weight of every decision she'd made in the last 5 days arrive at once, condensed into this moment, this kitchen, this afternoon. She had wanted a husband. She had gotten something harder and more complicated and more real than she'd known how to want. And now whatever was outside the door was the consequence of every choice that had led here, hers and Cade's and Price's and Thomas Garrett's, who had made a promise with his last breath and set all of this in motion. Cade looked at her over his shoulder. "Stay back," he said. "No," she said. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second. "Stay behind me," he said. "That's different." She moved to his left, rifle up, steady. He opened the door, and Dalton Cray's men were waiting. Not Trent. Trent was there, but behind. Because what was at the front were 5 men she didn't recognize, hard-faced and armed, spread across her yard in the particular configuration of men who had been told to end something and had come ready to do exactly that. And standing at the center of them for the first time was a man Cade clearly recognized by the way his entire body changed. Not fear, not retreat, but the deep stillness of someone confronting something they had been moving toward for a long time. Dalton Cray had come himself. He was not what Lila expected either. Not large, not physically imposing. A man of 60, perhaps well-dressed, with a calm and pleasant face that had learned to wear authority like a coat and wore it so naturally you might not notice it was on. He looked at Cade. "Voss," he said, "you've caused a considerable amount of trouble for a man who just came to honor a friend's last request." "I have that effect," Cade said. Cray's eyes moved to Lila, then to the document case in her hand. His gaze stayed there 1 beat too long. He knew what it was. He didn't know exactly what was in it, but he knew enough. "Mrs. Voss," he said with the particular courtesy of a man who used manners the way other men used weapons. "I'd like to make you a very generous offer. One I think you'll find it difficult to refuse." Lila looked at him. She thought about 14 properties. 9 before Rourke. 6 after. 27 years of Dalton Cray deciding that the land other people had built their lives on was his to take, that the paperwork was his to falsify, that the people standing on the land were obstacles to be removed. She thought about her father. "I've already refused your offers," she said, "twice." "This one is different," Cray said. "They always are," she said. "The answer is still no." Something shifted in Cray's pleasant face. Not anger, something colder than anger. The expression of a man recalculating from courtesy to the alternative. His eyes moved to the 5 men spread across the yard, and Cade stepped fully through the door and onto the porch, putting himself between Lila and every one of them, and his voice when he spoke was the voice she'd heard on the train platform, flat, even not unkind, just absolute. "Dalton," he said, "it's done." Cray looked at him. "You don't have the numbers," Cray said. "I have enough," Cade said. "And in about 20 minutes, Sheriff Bowman is going to ride past on his regular circuit, and when he does, you're going to have a choice about how this looks to a badge." It was a calculated risk. Bowman's circuit was real. They'd arranged it yesterday quietly, but 20 minutes was an estimate, not a certainty. Cray knew that too. The yard was very still. Lila's hands were steady on the rifle. Price was behind her in the doorway. Cade was between her and 5 armed men, and one very dangerous old man who had built a criminal empire on the assumption that people would fold when the pressure was sufficient. She was not going to fold. She had not folded in 2 years alone on this ranch, and she was not going to start now with her father's land behind her and Declan Price's documents in her hand and a man in front of her who had come here on a dead man's promise and stayed for reasons that had grown past promises entirely. Cray looked at Cade for a long moment. Then he looked at Lila. Then he looked at the document case. "You know what's in that," he said. Not to Lila, to Cade. "Enough," Cade said again. The silence stretched. And then from the South Road, exactly when Cade had said he'd come, exactly when they needed him to be real, the sound of a single horse, steady and unhurried, came up toward the Rafter C gate. Bowman. Cray heard it. Every man in the yard heard it. The calculus changed. Not completely. Not finally. Cray was too old and too careful to make irreversible moves in front of a witness he hadn't controlled. But the particular configuration of 5 armed men in a private yard became, with the sound of a badge on horseback, a public situation with a different set of consequences. Cray's face went through something that was not surrender, but was its close relative, the expression of a man deferring, not giving up. "We'll finish this conversation another time," he said. "In court," Lila said. Cray looked at her one last time, and in his face she saw it not respect exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man encountering something he hadn't fully accounted for. He turned. His men followed. They rode south, passing Bowman on the road with the particular pointed normalcy of people who had not been doing anything they'd need to explain. Bowman came through the gate. He looked at Cade, at Lila, at Price in the doorway, at the document case. "I'm guessing," he said slowly, "that the 20 minutes was not entirely accurate." "You were early," Cade said. "Lucky for someone." Bowman dismounted and looked around the yard. "Is that what I think it is?" Lila held up the document case. 14 properties, she said. 4 years of records, original documentation. She held his gaze. "We need to get this to Judge Pruitt tonight, and we need to file a criminal complaint with the Territorial Attorney General tomorrow morning." Bowman looked at the case. He looked at Price. He looked at Cade. Then he looked at Lila, at the woman who had been standing alone on this ranch for 2 years and was now standing with a rifle in one hand and 4 years of evidence in the other, and had just held her ground against Dalton Cray to his face. "All right," he said. He said it the way people said things when they'd made a decision that had been a long time coming. "Let's go see the judge." They went to Pruitt that night. All 4 of them, Lila, Cade, Price, and Bowman, crowded into the judge's back office with the document case open on his desk and every lamp in the room burning. Pruitt read in silence. He read the way he always read, with full attention, but something in his posture changed as he moved through Price's records, a progressive stillness. The stillness of a man whose understanding of a situation is expanding past what he'd prepared for. He set down the last page. He looked at Price. "You kept all of this?" "Every page," Price said. "Originals where I had them. Certified copies where I didn't. For 4 years. 4 years and 3 months. Pruitt looked at Bowman. "You were present when Cray's men came to the ranch today." "I rode up as they were leaving," Bowman said. "I saw Cray. I can testify to his presence on the property." "Which means he came personally," Pruitt said. "Which means he was frightened enough to come personally." "He saw the document case," Lila said. "He knew what it meant, even if he didn't know exactly what was in it." Pruitt folded his hands on top of Price's records. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the judge's habit she'd learned of giving himself space to think before he spoke. When he looked back down, his eyes had the quality she'd first seen when he accepted their filing. Not excitement, but resolve. The expression of a man who had been a fair judge in a territory that made fairness difficult, and had just been handed the means to do something about it. "I'll hear the civil proceeding on the original schedule," he said. "The jurisdictional challenge against the district court filing, I'm ruling on that tonight. The procedural concealment is clear. I'm dismissing the counterclaim from my proceeding and filing a formal complaint to the district court about the failure to disclose." He paused. "That handles your land, Mrs. Voss. The debt is stayed pending hearing. No foreclosure can proceed." Lila felt something release in her chest. Not dramatically, Not with any particular display, just the slow unwinding of something that had been coiled for 2 years. "The criminal matter," Cade said. "That goes to the Territorial Attorney General in Denver. Tomorrow, by special courier, I'm signing the transmittal letter myself, which means it can't be quietly redirected or delayed." Prewitt looked at Price. "You'll need to go to Denver, testify in person." "I know," Price said. "I'll go." "It won't be safe," Prewitt said. Not to frighten him, just plainly. "It hasn't been safe for 4 years," Price said. "At least this time it means something." Prewitt nodded. He began writing. They left his office 2 hours later into the full dark of Dust Ridge at midnight, and the town was quiet around them, the way frontier towns were quiet at that hour. Not peaceful exactly, but temporarily still, the pause between things. Lila stood on the courthouse steps and breathed. Just breathed. Cade stood beside her, not close, not distant. The measured presence she'd been learning for 5 days. Price and Bowman were behind them, talking in low voices about logistics. The courier, the timing, the safest route to Denver. "It's not over," Cade said quietly. "I know," she said. "Cray still has lawyers. The Attorney General's proceeding will take months. He'll fight every page. I know that too. Your land is safe for now, but now isn't, Cade." She said it quietly, but with enough weight that he stopped. She turned to look at him there on the courthouse steps, where 5 days ago she'd walked away from a marriage ceremony, and she looked at him the way she'd been learning to look at him past the surface of him, past the gun and the history, and the careful neutral face, into the actual person Thomas Garrett had trusted with his last breath. "I know it isn't finished. I know it's going to be long and difficult, and Cray is going to fight. I understand all of that." She held his gaze. "But tonight, in this specific moment, can we acknowledge that we didn't lose?" He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, and for the first time since the train platform, she saw it fully, the thing he kept under everything else. Not the controlled steadiness, not the careful calculation. Something that had been waiting for an occasion that felt safe enough to surface. "We didn't lose," he said. "No," she said. "We didn't." They rode back to the ranch in the dark, the 4 of them, and Lila didn't look at the road. She looked at the sky, which was doing what the Colorado Territory sky did when it wasn't trying to be weather, spreading itself out in full, with more stars than any one person had a right to see. The kind of sky that made the smallness of individual problems feel true without making the problems feel meaningless. Her father had loved this sky. She thought she understood why for the first time in 2 years, without grief attached to it. Price slept in the barn. Bowman rode home. She and Cade came into the house, and she put the document case in her father's desk, the safest place she could think of, the desk that had held her family's records for 30 years. And she latched it, and turned around, and found Cade standing in the kitchen, with his hat in his hands, not moving toward the door, just standing. "You're not going to take watch?" she said. "I was going to," he said. "Yes." "Sit down," she said. He sat. She poured 2 glasses of the whiskey she kept in the back of the pantry. She'd bought it the week she filed the first debt restructuring, told herself she'd drink it when it was resolved, and hadn't opened it since. She put 1 glass in front of him and sat across the table. He looked at the glass, then at her. "Thomas drank whiskey," he said. "Terrible taste," she said. He mentioned it in his second letter, said he'd had whiskey in a mountain camp that tasted like regret, and he'd drunk all of it anyway. Something real moved through Cade's face. A grief that was finally in this kitchen at this hour, allowed to be present without being managed. He picked up the glass and held it without drinking it, and she understood he was holding it the way you held something that connected you to someone who was gone. "Tell me something about him," she said. "That he didn't put in the letters." Cade was quiet for a moment. "He talked in his sleep," he said finally. "Whole conversations. In the camp, the men near his tent would listen and try to figure out who he was arguing with. Never could. He'd wake up completely cheerful, no memory of any of it." The corner of his mouth moved. "He was the worst card player I've ever met, and he played every chance he got. Lost every time. Didn't care even slightly. Lila smiled. It came without planning which was the best kind. He wrote that he was good at cards, she said. He absolutely believed that, Cade said. That was the thing about Thomas. He believed things thoroughly, including things that were demonstrably false, including that sending you here was a good idea. Cade looked at her. Including that. She held his gaze. Was it? He thought about it the way he always thought about things that deserved real answers. Not the careful pause of a man buying time, but the genuine pause of someone taking the question seriously. I don't know yet what I am for this place, he said. I know what I've done this week. I know what I'm going to keep doing while Cray fights this in court. He set the glass down. But whether I'm good for this place, whether I'm what it needs in the long way, I'm still finding that out. Honest answer, she said. Only kind I have. She turned her glass in her hands. My father used to say the land tells you who belongs on it. Give it time, and it'll tell you. How long did it take him to know he belonged? He said the first winter. She looked at the table. He said the first real hard winter, the kind that tests whether you're going to stay, and then you know. Either you're the kind of person who stays when it's hard, or you're not. And if you are, then you belong, she said simply. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the territory was dark and enormous, and completely indifferent to the specific people in this specific house, which was Lila thought actually a comfort. The land didn't ask you to be significant. It just asked you to be present, to show up every morning and do the work and let the seasons tell you where you stood. She'd been showing up every morning for 2 years. She had a feeling Cade Voss was the kind of man who showed up every morning. She didn't say any of that. It was too large for midnight whiskey conversation, too much of a statement that she wasn't ready to make in words yet. But she thought it, and she let it settle in the quiet between them, and she thought that was enough for tonight. Drink your whiskey, she said. It's a better occasion than the one I bought it for. He drank it. So did she. They didn't talk for a while after that, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that two people only reached when they'd been through something together, and come out the other side, not the same as they went in, but intact. More than intact. She went to bed. He went to the door. Cade, she said. He turned. You don't have to take watch tonight, she said. The judge has the documents. Bowman knows. Price is here. Cray's not going to move tonight. Moving tonight would hand us everything. She held his gaze. Sleep. You've earned it. He held her gaze for a long moment. All right, he said. She went to her room. He went to the barn, and the rafter sea was quiet for the first time in 5 days, with the particular quality of quiet that was not the absence of trouble, but the presence of something stronger than it. The hearing was 8 days later. Prewitt's courtroom was small, and the wooden benches were full, which surprised Lila when she walked in, and then did not surprise her because Dust Ridge was a small town, and small towns came to watch things that mattered. She saw faces she recognized, and faces she didn't, and she walked to the plaintiff's table with Cade beside her, and Price behind them, and the document case under her arm, and she sat down. Across the room, Cray's territorial lawyers, 2 of them polished and expensively dressed, the kind of men who wore the confidence of a man who had never yet lost, sat at the defense table and arranged their papers with the calm of people who believed the outcome was already determined. Prewitt entered. The room went quiet. What happened in the next 3 hours was not dramatic in the way that stories made courtrooms dramatic. It was methodical, detailed. The patient incremental work of building an argument from evidence document by document, date by date, the 9 days of discrepancy in a postmarked envelope growing into the larger picture of a system that had done this 14 times before. Price testified for 40 minutes. He was a composed and specific witness, the kind of witness who answered exactly what was asked, and no more, which made him very difficult to discredit, as Cray's lawyers discovered when they tried. Cade testified for 20. His history with Cray was entered into evidence by Cray's lawyers as planned, and then Lila watched Prewitt handle it, Watch the judge take the history that was supposed to destroy their credibility and contextualize it with 3 specific documents from Price's records showing that Cray had used coercion and threat to maintain participation from people who would otherwise have refused. Cray's lawyers objected. Prewitt overruled them. Twice. The third time they objected, Prewitt set down his pen and looked at them over his spectacles with the expression of a man who had been a fair judge in a difficult territory for 20 years and had something specific he wanted to say. "Counsel," he said, "I have reviewed 4 years of your client's documented business practices in this territory. I have reviewed the specific transaction at issue in this proceeding. I have reviewed the filing records in my own county recorder's office, including a document that was fraudulently backdated. And I have reviewed your client's filing in the district court, which concealed the existence of this prior proceeding in violation of clear procedural rules." He paused. "I would recommend that your objections from this point forward be very carefully chosen." The courtroom was very still. Cray's lawyer sat down. Prewitt ruled. The foreclosure action was dismissed. The debt was not erased. Lila had not expected it to be erased, and she hadn't asked for that. What she'd asked for was time and fair terms, and what Prewitt gave her was both a mandatory restructuring of the debt under Territorial Consumer Protection Statute, with payments set at a rate the ranch could actually sustain, and a prohibition on the transfer of that debt to any party without 30 days written notice to the deed holder properly postmarked and witnessed. Territorial Resources Consolidated was referred to the Attorney General's Office for Criminal Investigation, along with Prewitt's own formal letter recommending expedited review given the volume of documented fraud. Cray's lawyers gathered their papers in silence. Lila sat at the plaintiff's table and held the ruling in her hands and read it twice. Then she set it down carefully on top of her father's ledger, which she'd brought to the courtroom because she'd wanted it present. She wasn't sure she could have explained why to anyone else, but she'd wanted the ledger there, the 30 years of her father's work present for the day it was finally protected. She felt Cade's hand on the table beside hers, not holding it. Just there. She put her hand over his. Just for a moment. Then she stood up. Price shook her hand across the table. His face had the expression of a man who had been carrying something for 4 years, and had just in this small courtroom set it down. "Go to Denver safely," she said. "I'll go through the North Pass," he said. Slower, less visible. "Bowman will ride with you to the county line." Price nodded. He looked at Cade. They did the thing, they did the wordless communication that she'd decided was the language of men who had been through things together that didn't translate into ordinary speech. "We're square," Price said. "You were never in debt to me," Cade said. "I know, but we're square anyway." Price left with Bowman through the back of the courtroom. Lila and Cade walked out the front. The afternoon had come up warm, the particular warmth of late Colorado summer, generous and clear, and the main street of Dust Ridge was going about its business with the indifference of a town that hadn't attended the hearing and would hear about it secondhand and form its opinions accordingly. She didn't care what the town thought. She had never particularly cared what the town thought. They were at the edge of the courthouse square when a man stepped out of the assay office doorway. She didn't recognize him for a moment, then she did. The man from the courthouse square on the day of her wedding. Dark hat. Standing and watching. He wasn't watching now. He walked directly to Cade and said something in a low voice too quiet for Lila to hear. Cade listened. His expression didn't change. He said 2 words back. The man nodded and walked away. Lila waited. "Trent," Cade said. "He left this morning. Rode east." Cray told him to go. Cray told everyone local to go. After last night, after whatever his lawyers telegraphed him about the Attorney General referral. He paused. "He's pulling back, regrouping. He's not finished, but he's not moving against us directly while the criminal investigation is open. Because every move he makes against us now is evidence," she said. Yes. She looked at the street. At the ordinary afternoon business of Dust Ridge. At the sky above it, the same enormous sky she'd looked at from the train platform 9 days ago when she'd been waiting for a man who would never come. 9 days. She'd been married for 9 days to a man she'd known for 9 days, and she had saved her father's ranch and built a legal case that might bring down a criminal operation. And she had somewhere in the margins of all of that begun to understand something about herself that she hadn't fully understood before. She was not someone who needed saving. She was someone who needed a partner. There was a difference, and it had taken Thomas Garrett's death and Cade Voss's arrival and 9 days of the hardest fighting she'd ever done to show her clearly what that difference was. She started walking toward the livery. Cade fell in beside her half a step back the way he always moved, giving her the space of the lead. She'd noticed it from the first day and had cataloged it in the same list as the knocking on the door and the early mornings and the flat, honest answers to difficult questions. "The ranch needs work," she said. "I know. The east pasture fence is 2 months overdue. The well pulleys are worn. I've been putting off re-roofing the second barn since spring." "I can do the fence and the well," he said. "The roof needs 2 people." "I know. I was factoring that in." She heard something in his step, not a sound exactly, but an adjustment, a small shift. "You're keeping a list," he said. "I keep lists of everything," she said. "You've noticed." "I've noticed." They reached the livery. She untied her horse. He untied his. They rode out of town the way they'd ridden in side by side at the same pace, the measured, unhurried pace of people who were going home. Going home. That was the right word for it. She'd been aware of the shift at some point in the last 9 days, the rafter sea going from the place she'd been defending to the place both of them were riding toward. She didn't know exactly when it had happened. It had happened the way things happened in real life, rather than in stories, gradually, without announcement, the way the seasons changed on the plains. So incremental, you only recognized it when you looked up and found yourself somewhere different than where you'd started. A mile out of town, she said, "You told Bowman you were staying." "Yes." "Was that—" She paused, not uncertain exactly, but precise, looking for the accurate question. Was that because of the situation? Or was that something else? He rode for a moment without answering. She'd learned to read his silences. This one wasn't avoidance. It was the real pause, the one that meant he was being careful not to say something half-true when the whole truth was available. When Bowman asked, Cade said, "I knew the answer before he finished the question." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "That's not something that happens to me often. Usually I calculate, weigh things, consider options." A pause. "I didn't calculate. I just knew." She rode beside him and looked at the road ahead. "Thomas said you'd make someone want to be better than they were," he said. "I thought he meant it as a general statement. I don't think he meant it as a general statement." "No," she said. "Probably not." "Lila?" She looked at him. He looked back at her, and for once, for the first time since the train platform, there was nothing being held back. No calculation, no careful management of what showed on his face. Just the plain reality of a man who had come to a place for one reason and found himself with a completely different reason to stay. "I know what this is," he said. "What I'd like it to be. I'm not going to make claims about what 9 days means or pretend I know what you feel. But I want you to know that I am not staying for Thomas. I am not staying for a promise. Those brought me here." He paused. "What keeps me here is different." She held his gaze. She thought about 9 days. About a man who knocked before coming into his own house, who made coffee every morning without being asked, who had told her every hard truth without decoration and had held exactly one thing back and had told her that too fully when he understood she needed it. She thought about Thomas Garrett, who had died in a mountain camp and sent this man in his place, and who had been right about him in the specific, careful way that careful men were right about things. She thought about her father saying, "The land tells you who belongs on it." "I know what keeps you here," she said. Something in his face went very still. "I'm not ready to say everything," she said. "Not yet. 9 days is 9 days, and I'm not a woman who says things she isn't certain of." She held his gaze steadily. "But I'm certain of enough. For now, I'm certain of enough." He nodded. "Just that." A single nod, simple and absolute. They rode the rest of the mile in silence, and it was the best silence she'd had in 2 years. Not the silence of a woman alone with her father's debt and her father's land and the weight of everything he'd built, but the silence of two people who had said what needed saying and were letting it rest in the space between them, where it could grow at its own pace. The rafter C came into sight. The barn with the charred corner they'd need to repair. The fence line her father had set. The house where Thomas Garrett's letters lived in the desk alongside Dalton Cray's documents, and a territorial court ruling, and the beginning of whatever came next. Her land. Their land now. In the legal sense. In the real sense, she was starting to think. They rode through the gate. Cade dismounted and took her horse's reins without being asked, and led both horses to the rail, because that was what he did. The practical care that preceded everything else. The man who fixed fence posts before he was asked, and made coffee in the dark, and kept watch when she needed sleep. She stood in the yard of her father's ranch and looked at the shape of it, every board, every fence post, every hard-earned acre, and she thought about the woman who had stood on a train platform 9 days ago, in her mother's dress, waiting for salvation to arrive on schedule in the form of a mail-order husband. Salvation had not arrived on schedule. It had arrived on its own terms in its own form at a cost she hadn't anticipated, and a price she would have paid anyway if she'd known, because what she had now was not what she'd hoped for. It was better, more complicated, more earned, more real. She heard Cade behind her finishing with the horses moving toward the house with the easy, purposeful movement of a man on his own property doing ordinary tasks. She turned to look at him. He looked back. "East fence tomorrow," he said. "East fence tomorrow," she said. He went inside. She stood in the yard for one more moment alone, the way she'd stood in this yard every evening for 2 years, but not the same as before. Not the aloneness of a woman who had no one. The aloneness of a woman who had chosen to stand here a moment longer in the evening quiet, with someone waiting inside. She looked at the sky. She thought of Thomas. She thought he would have been good for this place. And then she thought, but he sent something better. He sent someone who showed up, not because the situation was easy, but because the promise was real, and then stayed, not because of the promise, but because of her. She went inside. The door closed behind her. The rafter C stood in the evening light, damaged, and standing earned and defended alive with the specific stubborn life of something that had been fought for by the people who loved it. And it was in every way that mattered exactly where it had always been. Home. Not because the deed said so, not because a court had ruled it so, but because two people who had come to it broken and burdened and full of the weight of other people's choices had stood on it together and refused to move, and that refusal had been enough, and the land, the way her father always said it would, had told them both exactly where they belonged.